Jack Carter, chairman of the School Facilities Commission, and not an honor graduate from the high school across the street.
Well, that's great. It sounds like a great cross section. A lot of history here. A lot of people that been working on schools for quite a while. We'll try to gather all the notes from this thing, the meeting, and Dale or Shelby, can you kind of give us an overview of where we're, what this group or what we're trying to accomplish and how it's going to work?
Yeah, by statute, we're required to update these adequacy standards about every 4 or 5 years. So we're in that process of doing that now. And in the past, it's hard to kind of taken that role or that lead themselves, and has done a lot of that work themselves. Then we come out with the districts on it and get feedback from them. I wanted to try a little bit different way of doing that and putting a bigger group together of really people that are involved in that. That's why we got Senator Landon, Representative Angelos, who are the 2 chairs for the select committee. Here we've got a couple of our commissioners here at the meeting, as well as a number of the facility managers. And I'd like to do probably more of a comprehensive review than I think we've done in the past. When I was previously director, we went through and updated the standards, and I think there's more issues out there now for us to cut and discuss and try and work it out. Really what my goal is by having involvement from this larger group, from the policymakers on that, from go out to rulemaking. Hopefully it won't be exactly the same outcome, but the outcome of we've got buy-in from the districts and from other folks during the comment period on the rules. And when I say hopefully it won't be exactly like, because we actually did something similar to this, where we got when I was previously director, we went out some rulemaking and really did a cooperative effort. And as it turned out, we got no comments from the districts. It got the management council. The management council says, we can't believe there's no comments, because there's always comments. And we had to go back out and redo the rules. So at the districts, they all came back and said, yeah, we agree with what happened. And then we got passed. And, so I'd like to kind of have that same type of a situation where, as we work through this, and really I have no timeline on getting it done, but sooner the better, but whatever it takes.
Slow.
I'm telling you, have to go back a second. Yeah, and so anyway, again, that's why we've got the senator on here, so he can tell, no, we've sat down and worked on this with the management council or whatever. So, but it is rules. So when we finish up where we're at, we're going to go the rulemaking itself, that whole process. And just so I know the senator is, I know the department is, but I don't know if the districts are aware of this. But starting July 1st, there's some new legislation that was passed, I think, in 25. Legislature 24 on major rules. And so if there are any new rules that add, and I forget what the dollar threshold, but if you add if this rule that you're doing increases the costs, then any legislator and senator, you probably weigh in, can ask management council to go back and review that. But anyway, there's a whole set of criteria that we're now going to have to go through, which is, I don't know, complicate is the right word, but it is going to add, we're going to have some idea of whatever changes we're making, maybe what that's going to come up with dollar amounts, things like that, the best that we can, so we can explain that in the rulemaking process. Again, there's a whole new policy that comes in. It's just not this, but it's any rule that's out there. If it reaches a threshold, there's a new criteria that we've got to come up with. So again, part of what this group I think is going to need to work on is, when we're making changes, is kind of contemplating what that may cost in the future, whether it costs more, costs less, whatever it may be. And again, I appreciate the volunteers for everybody serving on this, because it will take some time to get done. Dan didn't mention it when he did the introductions, but he's agreed to be the chair. So he'll kind of help rammer on this thing. For the school folks, we tried to break this up, as you heard when you introduced yourself, to different quads of the state, so that you can go back to your area of the state, and those folks that you interact with, and keep them kind of up to speed on what we're doing also. As we work through this, get feedback from them on what we're doing. And, you know, in case we miss something, because again, when you look at all the stuff that's put together on this, there's quite a bit when we get into design standards and all that that we're really going to be kind of looking at. From my perspective, I get from a high end view, you know, a couple of things that I think that this group needs to take a look at. One of those is CTE space. So the new Rock Springs High School, the new Campbell County High School, a couple of other districts that we're working with. Right now, the standards, I think, for your CTE space is 125 square foot in the current rules and regs, the design standards. I believe that should be 200, and we actually gave that extra square footage in these new buildings. Not for every CTE type, but in those larger ones, you know, the ones that have automatically welding, all those kind of things. I think there should be more CTE space. I think that you're going to, well, I don't think we're seeing more of a need for that in the state. And I think that's really a job of the future when we start talking about AI. AI is not going to go out and do welding for you. AI is not going to fix your car for you, things like that. So I think those are going to be good, well-paid jobs to help keep our children here in the state. And so we're seeing a big demand for that. I know a couple of the districts can speak to that right now. Shelby and I toured the western part of the state here about a month ago, and that was the common thing. And even in a lot of them that we toured, they had more square footage than was allowed under the 125, which then falls into this excess square footage. And we've all heard the debate with the legislature and stuff on excess square footage and where that's at through the bill that the senators tried to get through on going from 115% to 135 on the excess square footage for maybe maintenance dollars, those sort of things. So again, that's the impact, for example, that we might have is when we're adding that square footage, that's more of a cost. We got to figure out what that cost may be when we go through this rule break process. Another one that I think personally that the group ought to think about, and there is leeway in it right now, but that's turf fields. Whether you believe in climate change, whatever you want to call it, I think it is getting warmer out, and so our turf and water is becoming more of a commodity. Certain parts of the state, the Colorado River Compact, I think is going to blow up here in the next year or so. I mean, the Fed already said they're going to make a decision. I know our governor is back east talking about it, and so if you take it from Laramie to Rock Springs, Green River, all those communities that get water out of there, does it make sense to have a grass field when you might not have water, or at least impact where there's less water, or the water costs a lot more? So again, within the current rules and regs, you know, a district can't come into the commission and ask for a variance, but they've got to make that case. Maybe we want to leave it that way, but maybe that's something that we put in there that, you know, those type of issues can. I know he's shared with us in the commission at a previous meeting the cost that it's in Rock Spring because of the rodents, the prairie dogs, and that kind of stuff. You're spending a couple $100,000 a year repairing the water lines in the turf field or the grass field. So when you add that up over 20, 30, 40 years, it's probably cheaper to have a turf field just on that alone. And so those type of things I think are something we should look at. Some of the athletic board or association is, you know, say you need like shot clocks and some stuff like that. I think we probably should have some of that in the standard for our buildings. Right now, I think the last time we made a change on some of that, but that's something I think this group should look at. There's a big discussion going on with enhancements and what's not an enhancement and those sort of things. So again, probably ought to address that. We're going through the rules and regs to take another look at that. And again, that's something that the select committee's been looking at. The appropriations committee, we get asked on that for enhancements. And I just think some of the energy things. So right now, I don't think we mandate that you need on the newer buildings that you have to have air conditioning. Maybe we should be looking at, again, what I see in Wyoming is basically a month on either side, or spring and fall is warmer than what it has been certainly in the last 10 or 20 years, and certainly from when I grew up as a kid. I think that's something we ought to look at. So HVAC, whatever, I think is another thing. And that's just stuff that I'm kind of tossing out at high level. You all as facility managers, I know working on your buildings, what you're seeing, looking for that input from you all too.
Yeah, I think that there's a whole gamut of things. As I review the schools, do remodel projects, there's a whole lot of things that have come up that we probably would have evolved. And certainly right now, I think in education, we're in an evolving time. When you look at how do you integrate AI into the classroom, because it's coming. There's no getting around that. Like Rich and I were discussing last night, AI is great, but it's not always right. How do we teach? What method and what programs do we put in place in our education? How does that fit in with how to teach to form the students? Always, it's not always right. Don't go running down the road, your hair on fire because AI said it to. That's the things that need to be done. You mentioned CTE. And you're right, the AI is not going to be able to fix your car, but it will be able to read the e-prompt and tell you exactly where to go and to get it fixed. And that's and how, those are things that are going to have lasting and big effects on this. And I agree, CTE is a huge thing. There's more AI taking care of jobs that
You and I have.
yeah. So there's going to be a need for people to replace my boiler in my house. So it's and believe me, that's well paid, I think, based on the price I got.
Another one, Jim, is your sped spaces. We're seeing that with a lot of these new schools. If you look at I think where we're sitting right now, when we look at WDE, it's like 14.4% of the students not free and reduced lunch stuff at this bedroom. And how does that figure into the square foot calculator, where what we're actually seeing now is an increase? I think it's 16 point something. Some of the districts that we visited with, they're over 20%. So how do we put that into that calculator? That's something that we work hard with Clarity One on for these two new elementary schools, is setting up those bedrooms. So where do you take that from and not whatever? Another one that I kind of always thought is a little bit of an inequity is, where do you put your boilers? So if you put them on top of the roof, it doesn't count against your square footage. but if you put it in the building, it counts within your square footage. So should it, if you put it down in the basement, or you put it in, you know, if you don't have a basement, you have ground, should that count against you, or to put it up on the roof does? I don't know. Again, question for some facility folks.
One of the things that I read recently in these trade magazines, and they said that last year alone, like mostly Canada, they said last year alone, high schools, boat tech programs have increased by 31%. And then they went into the AIs and servers and how they were so dependent on HVAC, the cooling systems. Next year, they predict 41,000 jobs are going to be needed in the country to meet the air conditioning. It does include our refrigeration system, so I can send those, you know, those articles.
Yeah, I saw an article yesterday talking about nationwide because of how it's changed. The billions of dollars extra we spend on air conditioning on electrical costs, billions. And so again, coming back, make sure, you know, we have air conditioning or power, we want to cool our schools to be able to do that. So things like that.
And meanwhile, the corporations committee that I serve on in the legislature is talking about the fact that we don't have enough power. There's that in the background. And then the conversation that Dale County got us going on this morning leads me to all these policy things that are flying around, one of which is every one of our school districts is losing population of students. And how does that factor into what work that we're going to do together to try to figure out? You know, when you've got 30–40% occupancy in some of our buildings, what can we have an effect in terms of rules or regulations on something like that? So we've got a lot of things to think about right up above us. You know, are we going to have enough power to even turn on the air conditioning?
They said power consumption is going to go up by 30 times.
Unbelievable.
The United States numbers I read, 40 million megawatts. It's going to go up to over 3 times.
And so Dan, we over in your neck of the woods, as you are well aware, that the petroleum industry wants to expand by as much as 30% for jobs, all the taxes that they pay, and we don't have any power to give them. So we've got to come up with some statutes that will allow them to be behind the grid and create their own power somehow. Rocky Mountain Power and Black Hill don't like those sort of things, but you know, so there's lots of things that need to think about.
Well, I mean, there's so many things that are unique to Wyoming. You're an energy state, and how is that going to get? How's that going to figure into power needs? And you talk about the HVAC workers. You know, the electrical, getting the electrical grid, the power system is up to speed. It's going to be probably 4 times what the HVAC needs are. So you're going to have linemen, you're going to have boilermakers, you're going to have all kinds of things that are not very. For the last 20 years, you didn't tell your kids to go become a boilermaker. That wasn't even heard of.
Yeah.
And now you're right. AI isn't going to put those things together. It's going to be skilled labor. So anyway, let's delve into a little bit of the history as to how we got to this point. Originally, when the state had their first, trip to the Supreme Court and lost, said the schools were inadequately funded. At the time, there was what we call the pipeline schools. I think there was 4, maybe 5 schools that were in that pipeline. And the state did not participate other than to give each one of those schools a block grant. Riverton got a $20 million block grant, and I think, Powell got a 15 or $18 million block grant. And then the districts, did a, bond election or bond, floats bonds to pay the difference. But the state never reimbursed them for that bond. So I think maybe by now Powell has got, Powell and Riverton got those paid off. I don't know. So and then all of a sudden, then they started the first adequacy standards, which we commonly call as the FGT standards. And those were prototype standards. They looked at what was necessary, what facilities were necessary to deliver the basket of what educational basket of goods. I'm gonna use that term a lot because everybody knows what that means. What WDE has said is necessary in your schools for educate through K through 12. That's the basket of goods, and the legislature spelled that out, and I believe it's rules for legislation. But those MGT standards were put together in the elementary schools, 1, 2, 3 section elementary schools, how many classrooms, what the size of the classroom were, size of the library, media center, whether they needed gymnasium or a common use facility, multi-purpose room, those type of things. And those lasted about 5-6 years. And at that point, there was a lot of pushback from the districts and architects and educational people that said it didn't give us the flexibility to come up with innovative ways of delivering the basket of goods. And so the school facilities department at the time put together a working group that included Rich, myself, and other folks that went around and said how big the schools have to be given a population of students in that school. And I know Rich, 15 or 16 different states that we surveyed and got the data to put together. We just plotted them on graphs, curves, and then did a regression analysis and said, here's the formula. And a few things that don't work in that formula is the fact that there's always thresholds that jump up. When you reach a certain number of students, the size of the commons area goes from X to X times 1.5. And that wasn't, it was kind of captured the fact that there was a third order equations, but it doesn't, it didn't capture it all. And there's a lot of other issues, changing standards. Thresholds are coming all different kinds. Program thresholds, size thresholds, legislative thresholds. There's all kinds of thresholds that get hit that aren't reflected in the school calculations, in the school size calculations. So I think we need to address, how do we address, is this size calculator a starting point, and then through good planning and educational specifications and look out into the future, repurposing spaces, all the above, figure out how to make those, if there has to be an increase. Mechanical systems, put mechanical systems in attics and on top of roofs. Actually, I think adds cost long term than just saying, let's just increase the space to put it on the ground floor. And I think every one of the facilities manager shaking their head yes. Yeah, but we can't, because of the rule, like, you know, are we gonna give up a classroom, put a mechanical room? Those are things that probably make sense financially, but don't make sense with the existing rules. So those things I think we need to address.
Can I just add?
Pardon me?
Can I just add?
Sure.
So it was in that second sort of evolution of the adequacy standards. Go to gross square footage, provide flexibility back to school districts. But it's also where we then integrated design guidelines. So then you have this relationship between adequacy standards that are broad in nature, specify that should have classrooms, you should have common spaces, you should have these things, but different than the MGT standards, didn't dictate what those sizes needed to be. That was to be decided at the school district levels with their architects and such. But with that, and this is where Jim did most of the work, was in developing design guidelines. If you're going to have classrooms, generally you're looking at X square footage per student for elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. If you're going to be looking at gym spaces, you're generally looking at square footage of X per student. And so these were then sort of guidance, but in their name, guidelines. They're not prescriptive, they're simply suggestions that within this gross square footage, here's how you may want to allocate those spaces. Adequacy standards say you have to have certain kinds of spaces. Design guidelines give you some sense of what those spaces should be looking like. Again, not prescriptive. Standards are much more prescriptive, guidelines are much more suggestive. And with that, then you have additional methods and tools like capacity calculators. If you're going to have a classroom that's 900 square feet in an elementary school, here's what the capacity of that room then is, as being calculated by the department at the time. And so now you have sort of a mix of different methods and tools and standards, guidelines, and methods all coming together for consideration in the work. Again, moving away from prescription, moving much more towards flexibility, providing some tools to give you a sense of how then to make use of that space.
So Rich, but to that, the disconnect is when we're talking a new building, design guidelines, that works very well. When you're talking about an existing building, it doesn't work because we can't take the design guidelines and compare to an existing building. That's not the practice, but that's kind of the issue, because right now we have several buildings throughout the state that are older. Are they adequate? Are they not? Do we compare it to the 100 or however many buildings we built in the last 15, 20 years, or do we not? So I think that's the biggest disconnect we have in our current methodology.
Another thing.
That's a good observation, Dave. That's something that, obviously I've struggled with when we get into a major remodel is, at what point is it a tear down versus a remodel? Yeah. That's a difficult decision to make because there's a lot of good infrastructure there that maybe you don't want to live.
I mean, another thing that we recently instituted on some of our newer buildings, and you see this in schools that were built prior to Campbell, in particular, again, Rock Springs, Campbell, I think are two good buildings which demonstrated they had 3 to 4 additions on them. And over that time, prior to Campbell, or right about that time frame. And when they were originally built, a lot of times the administration space is in the middle of the building. And so, or they went from, I'm going to say, and I don't know what the number is, Dan, in your case, maybe 800 students to 1,500 students because they added 3 or 4 additions. So the cafeteria was in the center, the common space was in the center, and there's no way to add on because they're in the center of the building.
Right.
And so what we're saying now on these newer schools for the design standards, and I think we need to capture that in the design standards, is we gave them extra square footage based on, because we're requiring that you be able to add an addition onto those buildings. So we gave them extra square footage for their common space to be able to do that. But we're also saying those common spaces should be built on the exterior of your building. So you should put the cafeteria, your common space, maybe your auditorium, maybe your gyms should be on the exterior in case we end up with in the future, because again, hopefully we'll have these buildings for 75 years. You end up with 2 or 3 additions, you can add on to that and not end up where Dan was at, having to have like 9 lunch periods to serve, the students in the high school. And so when we get to that discussion on how the design standards tie with the adequacy, I think that's something that we need to note in there. Because to me, that's just a lessons learned over the years.
Good point. Some of the other things that we've heard about the square footage calculator, the remodels is one that I didn't have on my list, but I will put on it. There's discussion that says it didn't provide for innovation and delivery, of educational programs. I mean, more and more, we're looking at places with schools that want breakout spaces, group learning spaces, collaboration spaces, learning laboratories, things that actually try to get peer-to-peer spaces rather than just a stand up in front teaching classroom. And so the design standards, the square foot calculator doesn't necessarily capture that, other than if you're going to have a lot of breakout spaces, collaboration spaces, can you reduce the size of the classrooms? That's a question that I always ask, and I always get no, maybe, or I guess. So I think things like that need to be discussed. One of the things that this is one of the overarching themes that we always, because of the spring, unless the existing court decision changes this, one of the overarching themes of the state participation in schools is equity across the districts. That was, at least my understanding, that was one of the driving forces between the first 2 or 3 court cases, was the fact that there's districts with lots of money, Campbell County, Ventura County, and there was districts with almost no money, like Lyman, I can't remember what district that is. And they're just how do we keep the equity so the districts can have the facilities, and at what point do the enhancements that the large districts, the wealthier districts can afford, when do those become standards and needed for all the schools? And I see those are some top level decisions that need to be they need to be incorporated in these new standards, because it comes up time and time again. Whereas the districts do talk to each other. That's a given. And so when one district gets something and the other district does not, that's an issue. And, even though it was truly an enhancement. So, and then the other thing that goes in there is the CTE facilities. That's changing rapidly, as we've talked about, and special programs for STEM, speed, and then we also have arts, fine arts, performing arts, it's becoming a major cost driver. You're spending $2 to $2.5 million on an auditorium just for the lighting and sound systems. That becomes a big ticket item, and all of a sudden, how far do you have to go for these facilities? And the fact that one district can afford state-of-the-art lighting and sound systems, and the other district, does all the districts have to have that? So, we struggled with that on the Rock Springs project. It's shocking how much it costs. And, we're being told that it's absolutely necessary to do a high school play or a high school concert. And so those are the things that we have to address.
Just another thought too, when districts are familiar with this. Dale alluded to the one association, and there's activities that all of a sudden come about. And when one district starts a program, so we'll just pick on softball right now. Softball's kind of a hot topic. If softball becomes something that everybody does, now you've got to find space for that. And it's not just outside space, do you have inside space provided? Do you have adequate size for locker rooms to be able to have 4 spring sports in those locker rooms at the same time? And those are unknowns. And so how do we build into this those guidelines to be able to expand some of these programs? Because once a program comes in, another program doesn't go away. At least I have not seen that in 26 years. We continue to add to it. As Dell alluded, our clocks right now, district expense, but we all know that if the shot clock gets destroyed, what's going to pay for that? It'll probably come out of major leagues. Timing systems for swimming pools, timing systems for tracks, all unfunded mandates that start at the professional level, come down to the collegiate level, then the high schools are all like, hey, we better get that too, because we're going to see 0.7 of a second difference in that track meet. Well, what's that look like? So a lot of different things circling.
Well, that brings up an interesting point, because in the past, it's always been state pays for physical education, districts pay for added programs, interscholastic sports. Does that change?
But I believe the offerings from the WHSA are considered part of the basket of goods. So therefore, it would be an obligation on an enhancement. To the shot clock thing, what I would tell you is our approach was it's an upgrade to an existing system because it was mandated by the state.
Yeah. But again, you're taking dollars that were
100% from your major maintenance.
I agree.
Yeah.
So now $30,000 in shot clocks, because you can't just put it in your high school, right? It's got to be now in your middle school, freshman. I mean, they all kind of know that.
So Dave, you just made a statement that I've never heard before. The Wyoming Athletic Associations, high school athletic association, becomes part of the basket of goods. Is that I have to apologize. I've not heard that before.
I can't get my arm around it.
I can't.
I don't understand any of that. And, again, just to take it up a level above what's been pointed out, great points made. We find ourselves at a time when we've got a group that is not interested in funding activities. So all of that discussion about AstroTurf and new timing devices, all of that stuff comes at a time when all of those programs are under more pressure than ever. Places like Shoshone are looking at 7th and 8th grade football and basketball and having your trivials back. And I don't know how that affects school facilities, but it's going to.
Yeah.
it's gonna affect everything we talk about with this committee, and then on to the special committee and to our commission. So.
And the rulemaking again.
Yeah.
We come in and say, we're gonna add turf, or we're gonna add this or that. The task that this group has to have is the justification to do that, because we're gonna have to justify that rulemaking, or it's not, we'll spend a year working on this and.
You know, ironically, the leadership that has taken over the last 3 or 4 years in the legislature is all about reducing cost. But we've actually increased the cost in what we're spending on education in Wyoming. And it's all because of homeschool and charter school, which I'm looking at my good friends in the maintenance world, you know, our physical plant directors. I don't know what that means for you guys, and I think that has to come into play as we look at some of the rules and the work we're gonna do on this committee. What about, what does it mean when a lot of kids are just staying home, but they still wanna come in and use these facilities? You know, how do we address that? How do we address charter schools that we may not have any input on? We don't know how they're built, we don't know how big they are, we don't. So anyway, interesting times,
You know,
find ourselves.
And Wyoming is not the only state that's struggling with that. Most rural states in the United States are very much struggling with that question, because homeschool, private schools, charter schools are becoming more and more prevalent. My home state, Idaho, just passed the a voucher program that and you're right. How does the voucher program work when those homeschool kids and all show up at the local high school to play sports? And not all of them, but a good portion of them do. And believe me, the coaches love to have them. So it's a double-edged sword. So like I say, at this point in history, I think there's so many different things happening in the education business that it's going to be. I don't expect us to get it 100% right, but I'm hoping that we can build enough flexibility that there's that it puts a lot of burden on the school facilities commission and the districts to maybe find a way to work it out, and so it's equitable across the state, work and fits the needs of the district. That's my goal. Is that I don't think in the past in the name of equity we've tried to do one size fits all. And the guidelines tried to add a little flexibility to that, but it didn't. I don't think it went far enough. And so I think that's one of the things that I would like to put on the table, is that how do we build in flexibility into these rules to the point where we don't have John and Dell and Shelby always going, how do we fund that? That's the
Jim, I think I really appreciate you talking about that flexibility piece, because through the years it has been a frustration at the legislative level, right along with frustration at the district level. I can remember visiting Commerce County when I was chairman before, and the superintendent walking me through a building and saying, we wanted to move this wall for a long time. It's not load bearing, it's in the way, and we'd have a lot better space, it'd be much more functional. Couldn't do it. And that never has made any sense to me. We gotta take the irons off sometimes. We gotta let districts do what they do.
Yeah, that was a question that came up, and it's actually what we're being asked by LSO to address at the next select committee. It came up, like I say, the first meeting was, is there some way to address this issue of changing the walls? maybe this is the committee to help us figure out a way to do that, because they're asking us to figure out a way to do it. I don't know exactly what that's gonna look like or how you do that, and maybe the answer is we're working on it in this committee to figure out a way to do that.
Maybe the bill should be, as long as it's not load bearing.
Okay, so Dale, I've got a question for you, and this may collectively is through. When we create policies in our districts, we try to make them broad enough. So we don't have to come back every 3 years. Still be able to capture what we need, but then if we need more. Be a little bit more specific, then we'll create kind of regulations that don't require action by our board. Does the rulemaking process at the state level allow that same flexibility where you can create something broad enough that still meets the needs that needs to be discussed, but then perhaps the regulations underneath it is something that, the state facilities department can govern, that commission can govern without having to go back, redo the rules themselves, but then create that flexibility that we're talking about. Is that something possible?
I think it is, again, we have to have legislative buy-in, so when we go through that rulemaking process, the governor has to agree, the management council has to agree, LSO reviews those rules, makes recommendations to the management council on what that looks like. We're required to take rulemaking through the select committee, so now they can't veto it. But if they say they don't like it, we generally listen, okay? And so, but we are required to update them as we're working through this process, which will be something we'll have to do. But I think the way where you can gain some flexibility, it's more work on the commission and perhaps the department to make recommendations to the commission. But there might be the flexibility that when you put that in the rule, because again, it would then basically a rule becomes statute through the process. Through that it says the commission can grant an exception or the commission can approve this. So if we have something in the rules that says X, A, B, C, but the commission has to approve A, B, C on the situation. A might be kind of what everybody kind of does. B, C might be some options, and that can be approved by the commission. I think there's a way to do that, and we have our attorney sitting here who works on the rules for us, but I think that's, I think there is a way to do that, but again, that still has to have buy-in from the electeds.
And I think the flexibility issue becomes more and more of an issue as we're seeing across the state of declining enrollments. How do you repurpose space given the decline in enrollment? And and what process do we have to get that repurposed space done cost effectively?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the school goes from 3 sections to 2 sections in an elementary school. What do we do with that extra section of space?
Well, Jim, I suspect that Idaho's probably running into some of the same issues we are in Wyoming. And I think about this all the time. I'm not sure it comes into play with what we're going to be talking about on this committee, but I think it might. That is, how long do you let a facility continue to run? I mean, if you're losing numbers to a point where a district has to sit down and decide that, right? I mean, is that at the district level? Because it's the state that pays for all these facilities. It's the state that stood them up in the first place. So how does that all play out? I'm not sure, but eventually, like Dell said, it does come in front of the management council, which is just a group of legislators that you've got to convince one way or the other. So I do think this declining population of students, that's a nationwide thing. And I do think it's going to come into play more and more on the facility side. Deciding, what are we going to do with a little school out there,
Do we start busing kids or we,
Well, one of the kind of tie into that, so when we did the studies with FEA to determine what the major maintenance calculation should look like. And we arrived at that 2.5, with 0.2 of that really addressing outside the building, 2.25 addressing the building itself. In that funding, we made a conscious decision to stick with that. Because we could have went to 3, I think it was 3, maybe a little bit higher than 3. And you could keep a building going for its lifetime. You could keep it for 1,000 years if you funded it at that higher level. And we said, we don't even know what education is gonna look like 75 years from now. But so we arrived at 2.5, because that's 75 years. And I'm not quite there, but it's been about, it's getting close to that when I went to school. And so it's definitely changed from when I was in grade school, from when I went to high school. And so what's it gonna look like another 50 years, 75 years from now? So that's really how that number came about, was we picked 2.25 on the curves that we ran from 1.6 out to 3.5 or something. And so I think we're talking about the same thing, because when I first became director, so that was 15, 16, I think Dave, Chick McLaren, won, maybe the Toronto, you guys were dealing with capacity issues. You didn't have enough capacity, started back in 12, 13, I think is when you guys decided to go with the 5-6 concept. So we've gone from this panic when I was director, we don't have enough space just 10 years ago, to now we're seeing we got too much space and it's gonna get worse in 10 years. And they ain't making land anymore. And sooner or later, I think, I think we're gonna see Wyoming grow, just when, I don't know. So I hate to make a knee-jerk reaction too, when we're talking a building that's supposed to be here for 75 years, unless we figure out additions to, and how do we handle that on these newer schools.
doesn't that come back to what Dave said about renovations?
Yeah.
Because the adequacy standards, as far as my experience with legislators, when you talk adequacy standards, they're looking at new schools that you put down, and how does that apply? And I think that's generally the adequacy standards were kind of designed for, guidelines, build it. How do we apply these? Because it looks like in the future, it's going to be more renovations than building new schools. Does that mean that we have to have rooms for kids with their own personal TV, so the homeschool kids can come in for a certain particular subject that they're struggling with and get through? I mean, you look at the way education has changed. I've only been around 22 years. Dave's been around as a teacher for longer. I was going to say a lot longer.
It's probably a lot longer. It's okay.
So he's seen lots of different changes. So I see these adequacy standards now are almost going to have to flex more towards the renovation side than they are in the new buildings.
So if I can, a couple things. So to your point about when the tipping point opening and closing a school, I don't necessarily think it needs to be in anything here. I mean, if you're a small district and you have an elementary, a junior high, and high school, or you have a K-12, there's work to be done there. But in a larger district, to be honest with you, you've got the cost of custodial, the cost of staffing, all of that. So there comes a tipping point where we're spread so thin, budget-wise, we're going to have to make that decision, not from the building end, but from the actual operations budget. So there are other impacts there, I think, that would drive it far before we would have to go to the commission. Then the question is, do we mothball? Do we do those other things in conjunction with that? The other thing to think about when we talk about declining enrollment, while we're talking about enrollment declining, what are we also seeing? And you mentioned an uptick in special needs kids. So in larger districts, we consolidate special programs into an individual school. For instance, Campbell County has 3 ASD programs, autism spectrum disorder. Each of those programs handle anywhere from 10 to 21 kids. I can't use the standard square foot multiplier for those programs. I have to have a common room. I have to have special equipment, those types of things. So those programs usually take 2 classrooms for those 21 kids. So while we're reducing enrollment, some of these district programs are actually gobbling up, more space. And so, I don't think it's something like in Shoshone. You know, you're not gonna deal with that because you don't have the number of kids that a larger district, you know, you've got house programs in Cheyenne. We've got skills programs, Natrona's got special programs, so there's something I think we need to include here that calls out for those things, and you know, who knows, 75 years from now, what the new specialty thing is, but you know, within the guidelines, it calls out for special education. So is that my classroom, is it my tutoring room, my breakout, but these other programs, we don't have anything in the adequacy standards to help address what that is. So what I would do is I'd go to the commission with an exception request, which probably would allow me to rename some space, but it may not allow me to get additional. But with the renovation, if I can move a couple of walls, we can make it work.
One of the things on major maintenance that I was looking at, we're not sophisticated enough there. But I think down the road, it may be something to address this remodel. Is, do we need 2.5% for major maintenance? Or do we have fund major maintenance at a lower dollar amount such that midlife renovation term, whatever you want to call it, 25, 30 years, to address suitability? That's the last time I'm gonna say that word, but suitability is that we don't.
Yeah, the flinched when you use that.
Yeah,
Me too, Senator.
it's degrading, the building is getting older in the systems to where instead of spending so much to keep it running and major maintenance, you do a midlife renovation in the building. And you catch back up with the current teaching standards and what that looks like. Again, I hate to go there because I don't think we have such a mixed portfolio of pre-Campbell buildings and new. If we had newer buildings, I think you could make a pretty scientific or estimated guess on what that number would look like. And basically the state would spend a little less on major maintenance, but they'd spend more on remodels at these midlife deals. But
In other words, do you point to 30 or do you point to 75?
I think that the practice of doing those midlife renovations does push them clear down the conditionalist, and you do get another 30, 40, 50 years out of it, but it's more adequate for the time period
yes,
that we're teaching.
yeah,
And I think that's the big thing, is that the buildings that we've built under the current system, they're flexible, they're adequate, they meet the needs, they can move forward. It's the 1950s, 60 buildings that you know, they're cookie cutter, they're double loaded corridors, you don't have that flexibility. With the 2 or 3 that I've done, we did manage to make them more flexible, and I think they'll keep pace. And so that would be the question, is when you look at your list of all the new that you've done and the renovations, there can't actually be that high number that can't be addressed in that way, which to me is got to be more efficient spending wise than tearing it down and starting.
I agree with you.
I think doing that too also allows, you know, we talk about special ed, we've got to follow the law and different things. I mean, there's sometimes like a joke with our special ed director. I said, if you'd let me put all of our special needs kids in one building, we would sure address some square footage issues. But I know I can't, especially by law, I'm not allowed to do that. But if we look at a 30-year renovation, then we can match whatever the current law is in hopes that it'll say another 15, 20 years before that reopens again. So I think that's a really good thought process.
You mentioned 30 years, is 30 years too long?
You know, good point. I think it depends on the building.
Yeah.
Because we've looked at some, hey, we're in trouble at 20, some at 35, we're still going strong, and you know, may depend on who designed it back whenever to have that flexibility.
And I think that's where, you know, an adequacy or systems threshold analysis is necessary. Say, we've reached the usable threshold of that system. Or that purpose. We need to readdress it.
You know, Jim, that, and again, going back to the flexibility piece, I was just sitting here thinking, if you, flexibility, really what that allows us to do, I think, is all of us are investing an incredible amount in these facilities. We ought to do everything we can and by rule to take care of it. And it's really heartbreaking to have to mothball something. And then right down the road, you might build a charter school and you think, that's what happened in our district.
Yeah.
Yeah, a brand new one sitting over here, and we just mothballed one that was only 10, 15 years old right up here. So that's a tremendous investment that just has gone by the wayside. You know, so I hope that our rules can help get at that and help us to renovate.
The Shelby and I, and Suzanne went to Austin last week, and we attended the National Association of State Facilities Administrators meeting. And it was interesting there. So there was a lot of states. There was 197 people from around the United States there. Not all of them use schools, some of them use schools, most of them are state buildings and stuff. But you know, we sometimes think we're picked on or we don't have enough funding or whatever. You know, you're sitting in your own little house here, we don't look outside. So there was a number of states that were doing single buildings at $800. The state got $800 million single buildings. And that I got up to get a cup of coffee. So the last day, all the states get together in a big room and they talk about issues they may have, how you solve this or whatever. I think that's part of the meeting. And I was telling them what we were doing in Wyoming and that we got this major maintenance we're still working on, but we kind of got to where we want to be. We want to work on 115. But I told them, you know, this year I got $235 million on the school side for major maintenance, $234 million on the state side. Everybody was freaking aghast at how much we're getting. And I got up to get a cup of coffee towards the end. I was going to come back in and text the director from Texas, follows me out and corners me for about 20 minutes. How much money do you think the state of Texas gets for their buildings for major maintenance? They had an $800 million project. They got billions they're spending on stuff. And of course, a lot bigger states, but how much money do you think they get on major maintenance? $120 million a year. We got for us $470 million this time. And
Just remember that when you get discouraged with those senators.
well, that's what I'm saying. You know, when you go to the meeting, see what there is no yet what we're getting in Wyoming on major maintenance. Nobody, but nobody has figured. We have states asking, do you think you really ought to do? You know, it costs a lot of money to do a facility condition assessment study. Is it worth the money? Should we even be doing it? There's a lot of states don't even. I would be willing to guess half the states there don't even do a facility condition assessment on their buildings. So they don't really know. And so really what the conversation was coming down is how do you present your needs to the legislature? We got to figure this out because you guys have figured it out. I mean, obviously, because you're getting the money. And so they want to know how we're doing that. It falls back to facility condition assessments, you know, the programming that we have working with, you know, I explained how, so on the state side, they don't have an SPC that they go to. They don't have a select committee and a commission that they go to on schools. And so the tie-in with the electives, that's again, from John here on at this table. Yeah. See, yes, exactly. And so we had a big long conversation on that. But I was, you know, it was just it's an interesting meeting to go to and see what's going on nationwide.
Well,
Some of them are a lot bigger programs, California and those guys, but taking care of their buildings, I swear they don't know what's going on to take care of their buildings. I'm dumbfounded. These states are spending billions and they don't know how to take care of their buildings.
give you, I mean, just a snapshot from my home state. First of all, Idaho doesn't, the general fund pays for, you know, we have the allocations for schools that are based on what your bonding capacity is. You know, if you have a very rich district like in my district, Coeur d'Alene, you get 30% is paid for by the state, 70% is paid for by the property tax, ad valorem tax. Statewide, 5 years, $100 million in maintenance is what the legislature allocated. That's $20 million a year.
Yeah.
And we have 3 times more students than the state of Wyoming.
Yeah.
You know, I had a legislator ask me, do you think Idaho should do value engineering on their schools? And I said, why? You've got the ultimate value engineering, it's called the voter. When it takes 2/3 of that to pass a capital bond, the voters decide what they're willing to pay for and what makes sense. And so I'm not advocating that that's the direction that Wyoming goes, but I just want to show you the contrast between 2 neighboring states and I don't know if you meet in the middle or not. Obviously, Texas isn't doing it right if they're not maintaining their.
Well, they've already called us, they've already called, they want to come up and visit with us. Utah came out, but they're having the same issues, they came out in January and passed a bunch of stuff in their statute. Because at state level hadn't been as involved, they want to get more involved in it.
But I say that, you know, that there's also things that can be learned from looking at other states. Like for instance, in Idaho, because we don't have energy money in our state, they do things that Wyoming doesn't seem to want to do. Like all of our CTE facilities are pretty much tied to the local community colleges, and high school, and local. I mean, in our district, we have 3 districts that share one big CTE facility. It's right next door to the North Idaho College CTE facility. 280,000 square feet of CTE facilities, and the kids are walking back and forth between the 2 facilities. And I mean, it's seamless to go from high school HVAC or machining to community college programs and get their associate degree, journeyman, apprentice certificates, and all that stuff is seamless between. And that's something that maybe Wyoming could do better, instead of spending a lot of money on their high schools and a lot of money on their community colleges. Bring them together. And maybe that's things we talk about in this group is. Money is an issue, and I think it behooves the state to say, let's spend it wisely instead of hoarding it into our own little kingdom.
Jim, that I really appreciate that thought, and I think you're spot on. I keep wondering. I'm having a hard time understanding, given what Daryl has said, and all the work that we've all done together for so many years. It's hard for me to see the courts come down and say, you're just not funding this adequately. And wow, or you're just not adequate in some way. I hope that through this rule discussion, it will help me to be educated as to what in the world are we talking about here. That's kind of hard to get your arms around. It's very difficult for a citizen legislator to get his arms around something like that, or to make changes in the proper way. We need legal help to do that, of course. You know what I'm saying? It's just a really tough thing. So I hope we can, through this rule process, try to understand how we come up short. So
Senator, I totally agree with you on that aspect. I think we can do some things better. But there's also geographic barriers we all face. If I live in 8 communities in the state, one of 8, I can do those things. I can share those facilities. And there's some things that are happening in Buffalo with the community college, and they're building some CTE spaces right there by the high school. You know, things that make sense. But there's also parameters that we have to live under from the perspective of ADM, efficiencies, adequacy standards as far as our kids making adequate progress. I don't have a lot of ability as a superintendent to develop some pretty serious flexibility within my day to be able to ship those kids off to Riverton to go do those things.
Sure.
And that impacts transportation budgets. It impacts all of those things. So totally agree. Can we do things better? Yes. Are we doing things pretty damn good right now? I think so. I think we've got systems in place that, operational budgets. Fremont One Lander had to deal with that. Jeffrey City sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. They've got kids that ride a bus for 60 miles to come into town to go to school. They hit the little kids, yes. But as soon as you hit that 5th or 6th grade, you're on a bus and you're going 60 miles to town. So use of the facilities, can we do that better? Yes, we can do that better. And I think that's be part of this rulemaking process as far as some of those charter schools are concerned, some of that is concerned. I disagree personally, my personal feelings that we're utilizing public funds to put money into a private entity to run a facility. When we've got facilities around that would work. So yes, I think these need to be addressed. These standards need to be addressed and we can do some things better. But I also think we're doing a lot of things right.
Well, I think we need to address, I think it all goes back to the flexibility aspect of it.
Yep.
Because this state is very diverse. I mean, it is, you got large districts, small districts, one room schools, 2 room schools, mega high schools. It's one size will never fit all.
I've got 2,000 square miles in my school district.
Yeah.
I have 400 kids, K-12 in my district. About half of those kids come from out of district to come to my school. I've got a few kids that ride the bus for 45, 50 miles one way. So yeah, it's not cookie cutter by any shape or form.
Well, I went to high school in Boise High School, and we had 23 students that arrived on Monday morning, lived in a dorm, and went home Friday night. And they were from Idaho City and Lowman, and and Mountain Home and up in the hills. I mean, I didn't know these guys lived somewhere else. On the weekends, I figured they were just part of Boise.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, it's interesting. The superintendent just pointed out something that we never want to forget. In a frontier state, we have some barriers that other states don't have. And the other thing is the legacy and the tradition that Wyoming has within small towns. Most of us, at least up to this point, I don't know about the new leaders, but up to this point, we've cared pretty deeply about our small town. We choose to spend that kind of money to keep those schools up and running because that's who we want to be. And, you could save hundreds of millions, at least tens of millions tomorrow if you wanted to start busing kids around. That's what I try to remind my Chamber of Commerce and business leaders. I just say, hey, you want to start busing Glenrock into Casper, we can do that tomorrow. Because we've got room in these big high schools. We can put them in there. You won't have any Glenrock herders anymore. You know, but that's really what it comes down to, and I think Wyoming has done a good job investing in keeping our small towns out there, but it does prohibit some other things.
Shelby, what do you think?
Well, we're a long way from where I've been trying to input, so it's a little bit behind the discussion, but I put eyes on a lot of buildings this year, 3 years, almost 2.5 years, and done a lot of Mercers. And sometimes renovation is cheaper and makes sense. And sometimes it's not, especially when we start putting in operational costs and look at a 20-year life. Sometimes those renovations do not come out as the best option. Sometimes they do. So I think it comes back to this flexibility in that you've got to look at what's right for that situation. And then they come out new. And then, so the next biggest challenge I'm struggling with now, I mean, we made some decisions when I started in 24 of we're going to pick the highest enrollment in the last 5 years, which is generally the year after COVID. And we're going to set that at 90%. After watching what's happened for 3 years, I'm scared. We're oversizing these schools. We're building in excess square footage, but the last thing I want to do is use that downward trend and set at 90% there. And in 8 years, we've done this and I've built it too small. But I don't want to keep building it way too big. So there's all these things, and I think it's got to be this flexibility. But, you know, we've looked at Rendezvous Elementary School now twice for elementary school and now the alternative high school. It has never come out as the cheapest option to move into that school. And that was the other thing that I wanted to say is while we're watching this go that way, someone like SPED, alternative schools want to go this way. And I know they've been trying to keep alternative schools small, but I'm getting more and more discussion. I've got schools that are like, we need a 6-8 alternative now. And they want to separate those kids, right? And so we're really seeing this. And so we're struggling with that too. And just alternatives go in the opposite direction. And then their space needs and the classroom needs are all very different.
Shelby, you bring up a good point. When you say renovation, we can do a full building, right? Got and go. And in my mind, when I'm talking renovation, it's adjusting parts of the building because there's parts of an older building that function just fine. But you know, if we look at security, vestibules, we look at the principal's office, or the main office in the middle, those types of things. I think that there's some things we can do. I brought up Dillon Elementary. We moved the office from the middle to the end of the building. We took a classroom, we converted it, principal's office, nurse's office, all that, and then adjusted the space here. So ultimately, I think we refreshed part of the building, but really the renovation was just two or three key elements. So I don't know if when we're talking about this, I mean, the Mercer's going to drive, replace, or renovate, but then that interim of how do we just bring this building, back into the present, I think is just something that we're missing out on, and I think we could do, and I think make the legislature happy. I think it would makes our communities happy because then these are communities, these are neighborhood schools. We build a new one, it's going to go over there because you never have open land in the middle of town. So if you can keep them there, they're happy. They're way out there. Exactly. So,
and I think that comes back to that dirty word Dell said a minute ago. That's kind of more of a suitability. And that's exactly what we ended up doing. Our recommendation to the commission next week was really more of a partial remodel to a school to make it work. So, that's always in our basket of goods when we're looking at those Mercers. And they're not always remodels, and they're not always, or one of those two. They can be just, we need to go in and fix it.
So I'd like to take a break, but let me just summarize what I've heard. Rules, we need to build in the rules more flexibility. Because of the diversity of the state, diversity of programs, and it would probably, and the flexibility would probably end up reducing the state's outlay because it provides alternatives rather than trying to put everything into the same basket. And so I think we're gonna talk about flexibility and how to integrate that into the new rules. The adequacy standards. When we come back after a 15-minute break, I think we'll, as a group, we'll start talking about and I'd like, we touched on it, but talk about where does the current adequacy standards, guidelines, standards, where do they fall short? And then I think once we figure out where they fall short, we figure out where we need to go to store them up or make some major changes, minor changes, whatever the case may be. So let's take a 15-minute break and be back here at 10:15. Okay, let's
Grab a seat.
grab a seat. Let's get back in it and I think that where I'd like to go today, and we've kind of touched on this, is where do the current adequacy standards fall short? I took about a little bit of that in the synopsis that I sent to you, and there's a kind of a you have the current standards, chapter 3. Is adequacy of educational spaces, adequacy of the capacity calculations, required program spaces, what is required, what isn't required, the value, we got to look at how do we evaluate local enhancements, and when do the local enhancements become part of the standards of the basket of goods? I think we need to talk about it's probably, there's a lot of and this probably isn't addressed that well in the standards, but there's a lot of what I call support spaces, bus barns, administration buildings, things like that, which John told me not to bring up, but I'm going to bring it up anyway because it's part of the programs. How do those fit into the adequacy standards, and how do those get addressed? And then do we want to trend more toward guidelines or standards rather than standards? Standards become a requirement, guidelines become a suggest. Just that. Here's some ideas, and so anyway, that's where I'd like to talk about is where do all these fall short? They're at least be program specific, it could be broad based. So start.
Just a comment here, we talk about flexibility, it's helpful. And so that leads to guidelines more than standards, but I think these are still standards because of the equitability issue. For the board of is if you don't have some standards, everything you rely on, or the majority of the guidelines, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah, it's in my closet.
For us to know how to fund a project when we go to the legislature, because what are building? If you have that flexibility, you have something that's a $10,000 thing, that's $100,000. But if you put $100,000, how do we know 2 years ahead of time to go to the legislature and say, I need a K-6 building if it's all guidelines? So I think there's going to have to be something in between. How do we marry? How do we look again, I don't think things are totally broke. I think we've got a pretty good system. I think we should hone in on those things that we see are issues. And if it can provide more flexibility, great. Again, that changing out walls, is that something that falls under this, or is that something else that we work on in a different department? Down the road too. I mean, even if we don't get it incorporated into the standards or the guidelines and design at this point, if that's something the department and the districts can work on along with policymakers on a different avenue to fund that. From the request we had from the select committee where they said, how do we address these walls, that kind of stuff, but that's the discussion we're having. We've had different terminology for projects in the past. Maybe they can set up some funding mechanism, different funding mechanism to address that rather than having it in here. I don't know. Just crossing that out, but I don't think it's going to be an either or. I think it's going to be a mix up.
Thank you. I think that's kind of where I'd like to lead discussion is where do we see that the standards fall short in allowing. It's obviously important to have some standards adequate enough that we can get the state facilities can figure out what needs to be funded and how to fund it, so the legislature can appropriate the money cost effectively. But so I mean, I don't throw this out. So in the past, in the first set of standards, we had what I termed as maybe prototype standards. Here are the base facilities. Here's the base of what you start with, and then we went to no prototype per se, all of the flexibility, and I think that there's some districts that embrace that work very hard coming up with good quality educational specifications, facilities, layouts, and so on and so forth. And then there's some that didn't do so well. So the new standards, do we have some sort of a comment? Do we identify what is absolutely the minimum base facilities that you have to deliver those basic goods? I mean, you have to have classrooms. Well, how big are those? What type of classrooms? How big are those classrooms? You're going to have you're always going to have English, mathematics, science. Those classrooms are going to be necessary. But then there's the I mean, I'll use CTE as an example. In Rock Springs, the CTE is going to look a lot different than it is in Jackson, Wyoming. Jackson, Wyoming, their CTE is centered around culinary arts and hotel motel management. That doesn't apply to Rock Springs. So those types of things, I think, those we need to have. Maybe that's where the flexibility is. Do we identify the core and then provide the flexibility for the ancillary systems that didn't become part of the basket?
So, yeah, just a comment with regard to this flexibility piece. And kind of interesting that our discussion, we know that we'd like to go there, it sounds like, looking around the room when we talk about we need a little more flexibility for our school districts out there. That comes at a time when I've got colleagues in the legislature who are advocating for a bigger state government, one that takes over what everybody does in this room. And that's very real. And the director can speak to that because they've come to see him. And we've actually done a study about, let's do everything out of Cheyenne. And as you can tell, I'm not a fan of that at all. I think that would be a disaster. But that's out there. So we're gonna go forward with recommendations. We don't know who that's gonna hit. We don't know who's gonna be on that management council the next couple of years, or how many of those legislators that are advocating for a bigger state government. Maybe they're gonna be the ones in charge. I don't know. But so that's kind of an interesting time that we find ourselves on that front too. So just know that these recommendations, like Dale said, we've got a long ways to go and we gotta go all the way out through that. So
Senator, I've got a question thinking about that, because I'm with the state with a lot of local control. We've got boards who are, and it's facility directors. We've got two different governing bodies. I've got a board who wants to do X, Y, Z. I've got, a commission and who's really kind of under the umbrella of our legislators. And if we've got legislators, and we've all seen them, who are looking at that, where there's going to be a huge fight on this local control and what's going to happen there. And so I think you're right, as we're talking about this, we've got to be thinking about, at the end of the day, who's going to win this arm wrestling?
I'd be interested in hearing basically this side of the table of what you think existing with our existing standards, what is broken?
That's where I was thinking too. Which of the standards that we have that are
What needs to be fixed?
or tweaked? Which ones are the easiest ones to?
So Bruce, when you say that though, I go back to, are we talking adequacy? Are we tying adequacy to design guidelines?
Mm-hmm.
Because that, for instance, we're building a brand new high school.
Yep.
Parking. So we've got the old parking lot. I'm building a new high school. We'll be adding parking to it. The high school is sized for 1,198 kids, and by design guideline, I will get just under 500 parking spaces. That's for staff and students. Not appropriate. If I'm a Title I elementary, the parking standard is, 4.5 to 1 ratio. By the time I get all my staff there are no spaces left for
Visitors for.
But that is a design guideline. But I think if I were to go to John and say, hey, I want to add to my parking lot, we're gonna go to the design guideline, look what that number drives to allow that. So, I mean, parking is one that I think is broken, but it does tie back to the design guidelines.
There are standards.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It's not all specifications.
Right. Well, and the parking is a standard. So if I grow it, it's going to be an enhancement. But I mean, I start the year, I'm probably right size, and by Christmas, half my sophomore class is driving. So it's but when we I always get hung up on this. So adequacy, to me, the definition of adequacy is that's the minimum. That's the floor. But sometimes when we tie it to standards, we say it's the ceiling because anything above that then is an enhancement. Okay, so we don't do an adequate education, right? We want to do a high quality education. So the adequate would be the bare minimum. We still offer honors classes. We do all these other things as part of it. So with me, the standard would be the bare minimum. We would hold everybody to it. Maybe the guideline is that wiggle room between the standard and what you're going to cap me, and anything above that would be an enhancement. I think we can have standards, and I still believe it is strongly in language in there that is exception language, because we do have a commission that always has education representation on it. So then we have changing times, we can go to that commission and ask for an exception to the rule. You think about doing the standards, do we do a standard for everything? Our book's gonna be this thick, right? It's gotta have the flexibility. And to me, I still go, you know, if we have a board policy and we need to be outside of that, we go to the board and we ask for the exception and they work through it. So I still think the commission is the middle ground or the player that we go to saying, hey, my district's unique. I have this one thing, go to you. I state my case. You guys decide whether it's a well-stated case or not, and we move on there.
I think the problem with that we've experienced over the years is a being a carrot and stick. And what's an upgrade in one district, but not necessarily an enhancement. Then it becomes the new standard for the next district. They see that and they don't realize that it was one of those things that was allowed, but a budgetary item. And now they see that in that school, and then all of a sudden it becomes something that they want and something that they see as a standard because it's not an enhancement and it was allowed somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's the problem we get into when we allow for control. Is everybody sees all these other upgrades across the state, all of a sudden they want every one of those upgrades as standard, and it's almost impossible to budget. Right. Without just saying, design whatever you want, and then whatever is up cost, and that's last place. And I don't think that's a good way to operate either. I don't take security that fund back in, even if everything's appropriate.
I don't think that could work politically or financially for the state.
It will.
You know, and you know that, Dave, that's been a struggle for eons as to what, and is there a way? So what I'm hearing is that one of the things that's broken in the adequacy standards is the ability for exceptions to be granted or waivers or whatever the case may be from the rules, that in a way that they don't become part of the equity equation. And that, I'm not sure how you do that. It's something that's been talked about for as long as I've been involved in this.
Yeah, I agree. It's really turf fields.
Yeah.
Turf fields is a prime example. Everybody has gone and asked for either an exception or coughed up the money themselves. So I remember when I was in Jared's position at UNA, they couldn't understand, the board couldn't understand why I couldn't go get them a turf field. And it's because everybody had a reason for either exception. When I went to Rock Springs, our turf field up at Farson, I asked for an exception because of the water season. They shut it off and the new grass field would die. So, you know, I didn't have a problem with going to the board for exceptions. And I get what you're saying is everybody sees those exceptions. But we've had people in the past. I remember when Mike Lowell was on the committee, somebody didn't show up for what they thought was an important, you know, enhancement or whatever. And they didn't get it. I mean, I don't have a problem with, you know, the district should fight, you know, should come up and fight. Dave, 22 years, you and I have gone to almost every commission meeting. And every time we thought we needed something, we went to the commission and asked for it. Everybody has that option to do. So is that really a huge issue? Or is that a school district issue? You know, each individual, you know, if you need something, you see somebody else got it. I used to go to Dennis Bay, I used to go to Dave. How'd you get that? And apply the same technique. You know, so sometimes I think we're looking at things and the answer is already there. Is it really that complicated? Do we need a committee of people to come and say, okay, for those of you who don't think that's worth fighting for, and I just sit back and we'll make it a standard and we'll put it in the guidelines.
That totally agree, but it is a little bit tougher. My district, unless I'm going to go advocate for that, it's not going to happen.
Why is
what?
Why?
Just because of people and their jobs and responsibilities. People in my district don't have the flexibility that I do with my calendar, that I can, you know, they're tied to a classroom. They're tied to our tech people. Yes, I do have a maintenance guy. But I have total with custodians and maintenance people, there's a total of 5. And so they're spread thin. They are. And that's economies of scale, and I get it. And you know, that's part of doing business in a small district.
But in that case, can they not defer to the project manager who's supposed to be our advocate?
What's that?
Our project managers should be an advocate for the district, right? They pretty much know everything that's going on. If a district wants something, they can speak for it.
A representative of the district, I'd say they're there to present data and move that forward, but not necessarily advocate. It's a bit of a dilemma, and it's a fine line.
It is.
Struggle with that all the time. Because in our minds, we have an idea of what the right thing is. Different circumstances and different situations warrant different remedies. And how does that tie back? It still comes back to some argument. And design guidelines and adequacy standards and statutes and rules don't always align to what our opinion of the right thing is. And so it's a matter of what does that look like? How does it work? Is there a way to navigate that situation and still satisfy all of those things and get what it is that you're looking for? Or is it a situation where maybe some of those rules are dated and change it a little bit, that type of thing? But I guess the point here is how do you make something equitable when everybody has different situations, different circumstances, and not all 1964 buildings are the same.
Yeah.
Some of them can go for another 50 years, and some of them should have been torn down yesterday. And so let me just throw this out, because I'm listening to this. There is process of getting exceptions with the school facilities today. And the dilemma is how does that carry forward with the next district saying, well, they got it, we want it. And I think there has to be and maybe this is put into the rules that there's a certain amount of certain amount of rigor in the justification that says to the next district, you don't fall into that category because of, this district got that exception because they shut the water off, and or you don't have the gopher problem that we do, or whatever the rule, whatever was put in front of the commission as exceptions, and whether the commission accepted it or not accepted it, that becomes the new standard or guideline to judge the next project with, or adds to it, whatever the case may be. Because that would really add to the work of Dale and Shelby's folks that could keep track of all that with the commission. But I don't know. Sorry, as diverse as this state is, I don't know how else you do it.
Well, I would think the commissions that we have right now would take everyone on an individual basis. I don't think that they would sit and look back. They might know about that, but they're pretty much independent, a fair thinking group. And I don't know what the earlier ones were or not.
I think they were.
Our commission right now would look at it, let it stand on its own.
Yeah.
So Jim, I've got a question. You did a great job this morning of kind of outlining where we've been all the way back to the late 90s, when all of this stuff took place. Is there any concern that the work we do on rules, standards, and guidelines here is going to miss the mark? In other words, I'm still trying to get my arms around what's inadequate. What have we not done well? Maybe I should be asking the districts that won the lawsuit, what exactly is it that we got to fix? Because my fear is we we could develop all these new rules, come up with 20 new rules, exceptions that are gonna hit the commission. And then the courts would say, well, that wasn't what we were talking about. None of this stuff even hits the mark. Do you have that concern? I mean,
Oh, yeah. I mean,
I'm just not sure. Obviously, we always want to do rule changes with good thoughts in mind, but I'm just not sure that gets us out from underneath a court decision that in part prompts this effort.
And I think the other dynamic in that is we're still waiting for the Supreme Court to come up with a decision that may affirm the district court or may say the district court went too far or something in between. And so what target are we shooting for? We're still waiting for the Supreme Court to opine on that.
Well, we tried to ask our legal counsel at select committee meeting, and they were reluctant to opine much because it's an ongoing situation, and so it is a little bit of a limbo time.
I mean, here's, as I, and I, keep in mind, I'm an engineer, not a lawyer. But, you know, as I go through the 2025 case, you know, the court found underfunding the teacher and non-teacher salaries, school facilities maintenance, capital needs. Elementary mental health counselors were, weren't enough of them. School resource officers, not enough of them, not funded well. School nutrition, student nutrition programs, student laptops and technology, all these were identified in either in the ruling or in the testimony. And inadequate inflation adjustments. There's a whole lot of it. As I read the district court ruling, it was maybe not the fact that they weren't, and the adequacy wasn't there. It's just they weren't funded enough. And maybe the rules are just fine. I mean, the adequacy standards are just fine. And that's what I'm trying to get at today is where are they falling short, or is it just a funding problem?
Yeah. I would advocate funding probably the biggest contestant in that ruling of just not having enough funding to do the things that are required. I could tell you, Dell could probably tell you how many buildings across the state with that. But I guess the question that I would have, and maybe our commission would be able to understand this. Let's say 20 districts are coming forth with an exception to maybe a standard or a rule. Maybe those are the things that we have to look at. So we'd have to go back and look at those commission meetings. How many times has a district, or how many districts have come back and said, and we'll just pick on the turf field. How many districts have come before the commission and said, hey, we need a turf field because of X, Y, Z? How many were denied? How many were granted? And maybe those are, every time you have an exception, if you've got more than 35% of your districts coming forward to an exception, maybe that's where we're finding something perhaps broken. I don't know. It also opens up a can of worms because as soon as districts hear, okay, you go to the exception, you get over 30% of the district doing that, then they're going to change the rule. I don't know what that does either.
Well, we've got some examples of that. And so let's take the CTE space and agree on these, Shelby, what's the right term for the automotive net?
Industrial.
For the industrial CTE, if that needs to be 200 square feet. If we head in that direction and we put that in rule comes through, what happens is all those folks now in the future moving forward new, we would allocate 200 square foot instead of 125.
Yeah.
But all those that currently, I'm gonna say land, or there was a number of them that have more than 125 in theirs, we would go back to the department and look at those CTE rooms, say 200 square foot. So you would see less excess square feet in those old existing buildings, because we would say that the standard is now 200. And I think, and Dave, I think you were involved in this, we did that with, I think, the gym heights, where those, we kept getting that, and then the last iteration, at least, well, maybe not the last, but the last time I was involved as director, we said, we kept getting all these requests for that gym height, so we took that in, that became a standard, and so all of those that were grandfathered fell out of that. It became a standard, so I think that's something that we could look at along your lines of what we thought. And so those things that I mentioned, the CTE space, the spec space, that's all stuff that we are hearing as a department that I think we need to talk about in here.
So perhaps that's become what's broken right now. And we kind of started looking at that and kind of there. So because I think you're right, as you look at it, what is broken, I don't know, but I think as a commission, now the things that you've addressed, Dale, I think is where, I'm not gonna say broken, but perhaps those are the things that we need to start to address and say, hey, what can we start to adjust? What do we fix within our rules or our guidelines? And then start, would be my suggestion.
Just real quick, in general, the things that have been enhanced across many districts across the state, I would tell you, those probably should become a standard because the districts have demonstrated it's important enough to them that they have found funding outside of the model to do. Turf is probably a great example. How many districts have turf fields around the state? And, you know, I think this one over here was the first. It was, oh my gosh, look at this. But now we've learned that the number of uses with turf, it's exponential compared to what you can do on grass. We get more use out of it, safer, you know, all of that. So to me, there are things in there that districts have, you know, part of the enhanced thing is it's innovation, right? Let's try it. Oh, I like it. More and more do it. That probably should become a standard. Jim, to your point about the lawsuit, what's broken, what isn't, I think if you go back and look at Frolicker's opinion in the end, it's not the new, it's the buildings we haven't addressed yet. You know, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna use that S word again too, suitability. It's the ones, and I don't, again, I go back to that. How do we determine what is it adequate? Is it suitable? Though that's I think when you look, I actually just went back and looked at that. That's what he mentioned. It's that we haven't addressed those older buildings timely.
I think so. And you know, this is from the outside looking in. My perspective is that, I mean, when the state had a lot of money coming in for the coal severance tax, it was easy to do those projects. And then when that money got reduced or virtually cut off, I think that the legislature had to make some pretty tough decisions, and they did. And I think that's what brought about the fact that the momentum of fixing the old buildings and renovating the older buildings really slowed down. And I think that it's probably, whether it's the court decision or additional funding, additional money coming in, or funding from other sources, but I see it accelerating again. I mean, this last budget is far and away bigger than it has been the last 6 or 7 years.
It is, but it's also restricted in where there's certain things we can't address because it's in the silo. And so there is more money there, but we don't have the flexibility to do some things that we would need to do.
Such as?
Well, there's a whole lot of money in salaries and benefits. But I'm restricted on what I can do. Major maintenance, yes, but capital, construction, can't use district dollars, can't use reserves. So what do? I mean, it's either my 10% money or I bond, I guess. So there's restrictions there that don't allow us to operate like we did last year.
So do we need a way to open up those restrictions? Yeah.
No, I think there's maybe a middle ground because frankly, part of our discussion is hypothetical. We don't know where the court's at. And I've thought a lot about that because we've got our guidelines, we've got our design standards. That's what we're operating under. I don't know. Again, I think it came back to the issue of suitability, not adequacy. So when we had a meeting the other day, Dave and Alex was in, you asked me about adequacy. Well, Dale, I thought you were getting somebody on to help adequacy, but I got thinking about that since then. And I don't know if we were talking suitability, adequacy, suitability in that conversation coming up to this meeting. I think what we need to address in here is adequacy, not suitability. We don't know where that's going to land. And in fact, what's gonna happen, I know, because we don't have statute. It was weird. The court said we need to address it, but we don't have a statute.
Right.
So the first thing that's gonna have to happen, if the court affirms what the district court did, the legislature is gonna have to come up with a definition for suitability and adequacy and put it in statute before we can do anything. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with what we're trying to do now and addressing adequacy. So maybe a middle ground, Jim, is kind of where we're at right now. What is in the current adequacy and design guidelines that maybe isn't working, but at the same time, keep a list of perhaps where we could head in the future that we can bring to the commission, we can bring to the select committee and the legislature to say, these are these bigger issues that really is kind of outside of it's more of a policy thing. And what do you think? And take it through individual legislative bill type of stuff, much like we did with major maintenance and the 115 to 135. Because I think if we go to all this work and keep in mind, this is a 4-year process. Every 4 years, we're going to be back at the table. So if we can chunk some off, I have this conversation with a lot of my staff over the years, and it took me a lot of years to realize it. Yeah, I worked in state government 45. State government is designed to be a slow, thought through, methodical process. You don't see very many radical changes in state government because of the legislative process and all that. But if you chunk away, you'd be surprised. If you chunk away a little bit here, and next time a little bit here, that you can make some real change over time in doing it. So again, we're told by state statute right now, every 4 years, we're supposed to come back and address this. So let's come back to see what the districts, you guys get feedback. That's why you're located around the state. Get feedback as to what you think are those big issues for us to address here. And let's address those under what we can do within the rules and the design standards. Again, auxiliary spaces on the outside of your building. The CTE, I don't think we'll get a lot of argument from the legislature on CTE sides too. They all see what's coming and they know what's there. And so those type of issues, let's address them. And if we have things that we think fall outside of that, maybe within this court ruling, I'm not saying disregard them. Don't address them. I think there's another mechanism to do that. So let's write those down and keep track of those as we work this process.
I think the other thing to bring up with CTE that we're hearing also, though, is not necessarily just size. It's how many CTEs programs do they want to offer? And then they've got to get their 3 classes in that. And so we've got them coming in going, well, we want 13 CTE programs, or we want 17 CTE programs, or we want 6 CTE programs. And how do we know when we try to size a building? And a lot of those can just be done in a regular and still be CTE, which is easy, right? It's those bigger ones that take more space. And we got, different needs in different communities. We got certain needs that are kind of statewide. But what I'm seeing is, well, we want to now grow to 15 CTE programs, and we don't have enough space to do that. Well, and so we go in and start looking, what do I look at? You're telling me it's not adequate, but I'm looking at your performance scores on your basket of goods, and you're knocking it out of the park. So how do I say that building's not adequate? And I think those are things that the districts know, because you're trying to educate in that building, that I don't know because I'm a construction person. But still, how do I measure that? And how do I go to the legislature and say that building's not adequate? And they can go look at your performance scores, and they're fantastic.
I think that's where that local control comes in. And sometimes, again, we're pitted as to, now the board says, hey, you're gonna create a vet tech program, and you're gonna create a fingernail program. And I'm thinking, okay, we're in the basket of goods. Does this all fit in? The board finds the funds, and then we're forced with the reality of, where are we gonna put this? How are we gonna house this? And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, how long is this program
It'll last.
going to last? Because like you said, you've got to create a 3-year rotation. So you've got year 1, year 2, year 3. And then we get a new board in 2 years. I think we're all facing a lot of different things as we're trying to meet.
Put it all on a card.
Everybody.
I know.
Well, the challenge on the CTE from all my years at college here, I oversaw and saw several programs that we had to sunset. And it was all because, be careful what you push for. CTE programs don't draw a lot of students. So you have to convince the elected officials that notion to say, look, be ready to pay for this, because you need a bigger space, you need a lot bigger equipment, which is expensive, and you're not gonna have very many students in there, so your student numbers, aren't gonna be very attractive. You have to be willing to pay for very few students in some of these programs. We didn't get that at the community college level and had to sunset programs because of it. So that's in my mind. I like the CTE push. I think it's appropriate, but we got to be a little careful with it from a policy standpoint, because you don't want it supplanting. You want it supplementing. If that makes sense.
So I think it's the difference between build it and they will come, or they come, well, now we have to build it. And that's I don't know how you is that industry driven locally? Or is that
I think so, Jim.
yeah, I don't think
Last
you state
time,
that.
How many people do you have waiting in line in your district?
Right now, we have 2,600 kids waiting.
Waiting, they can't get into class. 2,600.
Really?
Yeah. Dave, how many do you have?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, so we have places in the state,
Where they're
again,
there.
with equitability, uniformity of the state. You got areas where they have hundreds, and we're here now, we're, Shelby and I are here. The mindset of you gotta go to college versus CTE programs is changing. When I was going to school, it was really kind of starting, you need to go to college. It wasn't for sure, but you need to go to college. Then it got to be, for my kids, you gotta go to college.
Yeah.
And now it's, why should I go to college, have a $200,000 college bill and sacrifice 6 years without a wage? When I go to the CTE, I've got my two nephews, one of them's a diesel mechanic, got his at Gillette. The other one's a welder, got his at Riverton, after they got, and they're in the $100,000 range already coming out of school. already, and they had people begging them to come to work for them. They didn't even have to spend an hour looking. And so, if I tell you right now, if I had to do it all over, I'd be a freaking CTE and not engineer.
We had, 2 weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, we had John Deere representatives. The plant come to our baking building, and they told us that they would supply equipment, they would supply testing equipment to work with our automotive department to transform it into a diesel, so that they can hire kids right out of school. We just have an empty building right now. And so there is not just interest in kids, but there's industry that's hurting for people.
Yeah.
And they're willing to form partnerships now.
So does the interest, if it's industry driven, does that become an enhancement and then the school ends up, I mean, the state ends up helping you pay for the maintenance down the road? I mean, that's a big question that I have.
For us, when we purchased the building, we had the discussion. We knew that it was going to be the dishes on the ground. We do have where the classrooms are, that is 10,000 square feet. It's an enhancement, so we're allowed to use 10% on something. But as far as that, our district was well aware that when we bought it, it's a district expense. The district is willing to collect that.
Interesting.
But I think that's what drives perhaps some of these lawsuits, because this board right now thinks that they're going to spend some money. 10 years down the road, a new board in Sweetwater is going to go, why isn't this something the state's paying for? In the Constitution, it says X, Y, and Z. And I think that, Senator, I think that is where these lawsuits sometimes come, is because one particular board will say, hey, we want this. And then another community's going, well, Sweetwater's got this. We should, if we're being equitable, be able to have those same things. And I think this is where maybe we talk about suitability, maybe we talk about adequacy. This is where it comes. Creative mind, creative board, a creative school district comes up, and it's all good. But then why doesn't our Shoshones of the world have that same opportunity? And I think that's really the crux of what's happening.
Well, that's a great description. And I'll just say in all my years in the Senate, and most of them sat on the Select Committee on School Facilities, among other things, there's never been enough quick enough. That the time that was alluded to here a few minutes ago, in the mid-teens, I was on an appropriations committee that had to cut over 300 jobs in Wyoming state government. And we had an uproar in school districts across the state, not, I think, fully comprehending what the state was going through. And we're just now recovering. And Jim did a great job of explaining that. That was one hell of a dip. We lost all the cold bonus money, and what a dip. For 4 or 5 years, we could not provide additional funding. Not really. We did everything we could. So now and by the way, we put our toe in the water on the suitability. It was a disaster. There was a line down the block and around the corner. Every single school district had a suitability issue at a time when there wasn't any money. That's what backed off the legislature. The legislature thought, wait a minute, we don't have this thing right. Because what's suitable for me isn't suitable for you. And so we've got our work cut out for us, and it's going to take national consultants to help us do this. We've got to stand up some notion of beyond adequacy. We got to get to what's suitable. Hate that word.
But
that
how do you put a definition of suitability?
yeah. I'll tell you what, it's a bigger
That's
one than you think.
statute, laws, and rules.
Dave has an idea.
Well, I would just say that if I talk building safety and security, could we all say whether a building was adequate or suitable or not? Not suitable? So we've got buildings now, the office is in the middle of the building, they're adequate. But is that suitable to have John Q. Public wander
So
through the
you
building?
probably got access to over 500 your school respond to be there within 3 minutes. It's the same thing is suitable in that instance, it's gonna be suitable for pavilion, where it's gonna take over 35 minutes for law enforcement. Respond.
What I'm saying is, yes, I think we can make a suitable, whether it's pavilion or Shoshone or any building, I do think we can make it suitable. But I may have to move walls, I may have to renovate. I mean, we've done enough with school safety and security, so I mean, that's something I think could be here. I get that it's the haves and have-nots sometimes, but there's still this, I'm sorry, but any building that you have built in the last 20 years, it's adequate and it's suitable. And we may change some things, we may bring a different curriculum, but it's adequate, suitable. It really is, I think. It's the 50s, 60s, 70s that we just need to modernize. And so to me, there's some of these things I do think we can say, hey, suitable, it's pretty easy. And I get there's some that I can twist and I want the line down the corner and whatnot. But
Dave, let me explore that just a minute, because it's interesting comment. The buildings that were built in the last 20 years are primarily adequate and suitable.
Mhm.
Does everybody agree?
Yeah, except for Cali. You know, the day we stood that one up, it wasn't big enough.
Yeah.
I probably have some other examples. You know, I mean, I'm sure that we can find some suitability issues in both big roads too.
but is it?
I don't mean to be jaded, but I've just run into that.
Sure, but with Cali, is it when you said it's not big enough, that's capacity, not suitability. And if I have a building falling down or I get a building overcrowded, I have a solution. It's all the others that I have nothing I can do with. I think that's the frustration.
So if we want to, here's if we want to look at adequacy and suitability, what we need to do is go around and maybe look at all the buildings that were built in the last 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, 5 years, and say, you know, what parts of that are, you know, stood the test of time and are really suitable and adequate, and then reapply those to the older buildings and say, how do we go from here to here? Is that something that we can look at?
So I guess I could illustrate to that point. We had one of the first, I'll call it cookie cutter elementary schools when the first lawsuit came out. Clark Elementary.
It is.
Under
You call it cookie cutter.
it was very good. Yeah, it was the days when Bubba was there. Boy, it was a very cookie cutter elementary school. At the time, we went from a 3-section school to a 2-section school. You talk about the common space was put all in the middle. It was designed to have a second floor above our K1. All fine and dandy. I could put that there, but my common space would not allow it. It goes exactly to your point.
Isn't suitability subjective in that every time your administration changes or how fast goods is delivered changes, suitability also changes, because over the last 16 years, I've seen an awful lot of times where there's a complete paradigm shift out of the fast and actually over the course of time, I've seen it flop back and forth. A good example of that is, you know, that open concept. And we've got several schools right now where we've got security concerns and issues because of that open concept. And frankly, it looks like some of them are leaning to going back in that direction. But that's changed several times probably since the 60s. Where it was considered a good thing, then it wasn't. We need you know, more separation and to keep kids less distracted, and then they go back to it. So that's part of is if we lock that down on what's really today, it might be different things.
You know, when I first got hired in Cheyenne as an elementary principal, at the time, the SFD brought in GT in and they did a suitability study in every building in the state. And they found a way to come up with schools. 15 years later, I was in Andy's position. We wanted to know the progress we made. We brought the same company and did the same study. And again, they had a methodology for suitability. And I'm talking brand new buildings and 50-year-old buildings. And we had a score that worked. So I do think there's a way to do that personally. And I know there's folks in the room that disagree, but I think that it was.
I think it's not a disagreement. It's more along the lines of the ultimate usability of it. And it gets a little bit to John's point of when the educational programming decisions change, the suitability of a building also can change. And so then if that is then a fluid thing, how then does the commission interpret it? How then does the select committee interpret it when a building can move because of a change in educational programming decisions? So the number is meaningful to the district, and rightfully so. The question becomes is how is it then meaningful and usable by the other stakeholders within the state? So it's not a disagreement that it can't be done. It's more along the lines of the meaningfulness and the usability of it on a statewide basis when needs across the state are trying to be understood at a moment in time or over a biennium or something of the sort. And so there's no disagreement that it can be measured. Let's just sort of be, clear about that. I think some of the questions that have come up around what makes it into the adequacy standards, and this is the tension of quote unquote local control, when the court does not specifically recognize local control. So if you were to put security vestibules, for instance, in an administration space out on the periphery, and you make that the standard, if it's determined then that is the standard, the voices in the legislature who are saying the state should have the decision control, they then decide all of these projects are going to move forward. A local board may say, we're fine with how everything works, right? Because you may be in a community in which everything is copacetic, everything works. We don't have the same concerns. Again, the standard dictates the state should take action. The local voice says, why are you disrupting what it is that we're doing? And so there's this, again, flexibility, great. Equitable doesn't mean equal, correct? But the standard begins to dictate equal in some ways. And so there's this constant tension of yes, flexible, yes, local voice, yes, equitable, and equitable in the court's language, which is helpful to nobody, is that similarly situated students will be provided similar opportunities. You're on the commission, how do you sort of weigh that? If you're in the select committee, how are you weighing, like what is similarly situated in a state like Wyoming? And then what is similar opportunity when local boards have control over the decisions of what programs and how those programs are going to deliver? I have no answers for you, but it is the constant tension that I've been working in the state, and I'm sure Jim as well, for 25 plus years. I don't know that we have come to a great answer that satisfies everybody. And so some of this is just trying to figure out, like, I think for us, in the moment, what are the principles that's going to guide what makes it into as standards, what remains as guidelines? How do we treat the buildings of the past according to what we would design today? And at the end of the day, how do you treat the fluidity of the educational programming? And does it change major maintenance calculations from this 75 years lifespan to 30 years? And I heard Jim say it kind of under his breath, is maybe 30 years even too long because of the ways in which education, particularly with AI sort of coming in and wanting to dictate every part of our world, is even 30 years too long of a horizon to consider how it is that we refresh the buildings. So, sorry for the soliloquy, but it's sort of connecting all of the different concerns and trying to figure out the suitability question. Suitability for whom, under what circumstances, in what time period. Good luck, legislature. Depending on where it is that the Supreme Court ultimately lands on this. Clearly, Proliker was convinced enough that suitability needs to be addressed in a meaningful way. But what that meaningful way is, I think, to be determined, maybe as part of this work, perhaps as a separate endeavor entirely once the Supreme Court comes out with their decisions.
Yeah, that's, sorry, I'm just gonna say that is really what's I mean, the tension's always been there, and it's always going to be there, the state versus local control and all of this stuff. It strikes me that maybe our goal ought to be to get as solid as we can on adequacy and standard. And just keep our eye on that ball. I think that suitability piece is going to take more work. It's going to take bringing in some experts who can help us get to what the heck is that. And I'm going to suggest that it's going to be up to new leaders at that point. But I would think that they would want to go and create an entirely separate piece in a funding model that would address things like suitability or whatever word you want to call it. Because I think then a select committee or a commission could keep its eye on this is standard and this is adequate. This is what we're going to try to get funded. And oh, by the way, we've got a funding stream over here, and we're going to take projects according to that suitability issue. And you could treat that as an entirely separate thing. Since the courts have told Wyoming, you got to come up with the definition of suitability. Well, okay, guess we better do that.
I can make a recommendation, Senator. I think that might be best suited for WDEs instead of more attuned to the delivery capacity.
So that's a great thought. I hadn't really thought about that, John, but you make a very good point. Is maybe the goal here is to
We'll wait until after the election.
I think they just fumbled the ball.
I think
Nobody's here listening for the WDE.
Two things. Number one, Dave, tell me if I'm wrong, when you were talking about suitability, in the past, we had the NCI, what was it? We had two scores, we had the FCI and FCI.
CNI.
Yes, and there was four things that made that up. One was technology readiness, one was lighting, and one was basically your atmospheric condition.
Quality.
Air quality. Those are from an engineering standpoint, we can take care of. And I think those should be in the standards. The one is this thing that we're talking about is it changes from how the board sees it, how the principal sees it, how the superintendent sees it, how the state sees it, how we see it. Suitability. That when I came on you in 15, you and I had the discussion, you had served on something where they tried to figure that out 4 or 5 years before 15. Everybody could come up with an idea and we actually measured those other 3 because we figured out what those were. But the agreement from the committee, as you told me, was that everybody agreed that nobody could agree, so they kind of left that sitting there, and it's still been sitting.
They actually created an instrument, assessed it, but when they got the data back, they couldn't figure out how they wanted to weight it.
Okay.
That's what it was, which was more, and I think it's still on the book somewhere, the instrument, but.
So anyway, so again, and that comes back to my first comment this morning on air conditioning in buildings. So I think those atmospheric conditions in the building, CO2 measurements, all that. I was on the team after I retired the first time that went out and did the pilot, and I found one room in all those schools we measured where the CO2 was higher than what it should be. One room out of, I don't know, 15 schools. I did not find a single room that didn't meet the lighting threshold. And I personally was charged of measuring all those in every room and everyone else. So I think we're kind of there. And again, that's an engineering thing we can figure out and put in the standards that you need to meet those and take that one off the table. And I think it may already be in there because we're meeting. The second thing is kind of a different criteria that I think we all need to understand in this room. Is there's a very important statement in rules right now that says if you have a current school and you're teaching in that school is adequate. Because we, again, are tasked by state statute every 4 years to come and address this. So if it's not being adequate because you're already teaching in that school, an older school, if we change one thing in this committee today, does that mean all 467 educational buildings are now inadequate? Because we changed one thing in this that we do every 4 years? That's ludicrous. There's no way this study can keep up with that. And so I think that's why that statement is in there. You're deemed to be there. So my question is, how do the guidelines address if older schools are deemed to be adequate from a design standpoint? Okay. Because they're currently teaching in it, they're delivering the basket of goods, grades are coming out of kids. How do we go back and address that? I think that comes back to the issue you talked about. Is there a way that we can address those older schools and not necessarily do a remodel? Maybe it's a $10-12 million thing to go fix them to bring them up to meet these standards as best we can.
Well, let me just first read one of the original chairs of the school facilities commission said to me, the superintendent, he says, good educational leadership can deliver the basket of goods in a barn. What we need is when we don't have great educational leadership, we need to have the facilities that good teachers can deliver basket of goods. And I don't really never understood what he was talking about, but maybe superintendents can tell me. But he truly believed that you can good educators can make do with whatever and make it adequate. It may not be suitable. I mean but it's adequate. And let me just throw out, some things, adequacy, versus suitability. Classroom capacity, is that an Adequacy or suitability standard for both?
That's a great question, because that is something that changes. We just have legislation right now that's changing class sizes. And our elementary's kind of staying, well, our elementary isn't staying, it's like 4 or 5 is moving. When we originally built the classrooms, they were designed for 18. Now we're gonna put 22. Are they adequate for 22? Well, we get to your high schools, middle schools.
Or are they suitable for 22?
I'm gonna try to stay away from the suitable. You know, that's a thing. And so what's the legislation? Look at you, Senator, it's not your fault, but in 4 years, is that gonna change from 22 to 25 in our elementary? 25 to 30 in our secondary? Or are we gonna bring it back down?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the furniture we choose to put into a classroom can change it from overcrowded to suitable or adequate, right? I mean, we can change the size of a desk, or we can change it some flexible seating, whatever. So for 20 years in Cheyenne, we were overcrowded, right? So even though the standard was 16 to 1, 22 to 1, our standard was 18 and 25, and we'd let you go 3 over before we had to bus you to another school. So to me, that was an adequacy thing and a suitability. Now that we're into declining enrollment, and Andy's still overcrowded, you know, I'm in a district where we've got room. I think it's adequate, right? But again, I can make it something that's unsuitable. I can make suitable by changing how I furnish it for that. To a point.
To a point, because I was gonna say, you know, we've got a lot of millwork that's kind of in the way.
Yeah.
That's things that it's like.
Yeah. So if it's not flexible and stair, then it's not adequate, but
Yeah.
I mean, if it's wide open, and I mean, gosh, the building we build now, you know, we put a little cage around the middle, but I mean, we won't put islands in a science room anymore because we know that locks down what you can do. So again, back to flexibility.
I appreciate that comment, because I've been thinking about that a lot, because we can go back to the Laramie one, the 2012, 2013, it went to 16 to 1 with what caused the capacity issue across your district and started the whole 5-6 ball rolling, because the classrooms were bigger than that and they dropped. Well, we just made this recent change to 22. I'm working with a district that happens to be one of our few growing districts. And they sized, and this is a pretty new school, sized all their classrooms for 21. And it's small enough now that the capacity's hitting them, right? You know, because they sized them all small. And they're like, well, we need bigger classrooms. I'm like, well, I can't really help you with that, you know? And so how do we think about sizing classrooms to be flexible and still function without us now looking at the school going, well, we've got a capacity issue because they increased it to 22.
And the complicator there is in the block grant, they only gave you enough money for so many teachers and stuff. Because we spent a whole lot of time saying we've got a lot of excess square footage because the student population is declining. So I bet you got some classrooms you could put those extra kids in, but you don't have enough money to get the teacher, teach those other kids, break them 30 kids into 2 15s. You don't have the other teacher to do that. Because it's based on that training or whatever it is. So yeah.
And you have ATE classes that can't be that big because of the programming. I mean, you take welding, you're not gonna have 25 kids in a welding class. You don't wanna put them in a shop. I mean,
If we're not gonna be adding a lot of additional square footage, it's probably gonna increase the size of the weight.
Yeah.
Because when we increase that to 200 square foot per student, then you're restricted.
Right.
Well, that's not gonna change how we populate them on a schedule. We'll go to what we can do. So your numbers are what you drive is overcrowded. We're gonna make a determination in those labs of how many stations are having what, try to be safe, because Yours is kind of the standard to drive capacity, but it's in the scheduling world, it's.
And I think that goes in, you know, 200 is adequate. But then you get to where the suitability and that, it's like to say, you know, we'll figure out a way to get the kids in there, make the space suitable. I think suitability is kind of the electric wire in the fence. But we don't want to touch it.
Yeah, when I described, you know, back when we gave it an effort, it really was dipping a toe in the water and discovering there was a whole bunch of green algae in there. You know, we got the hell out of the water and we just have not ever landed on an ability to really hone in on what that is.
Well,
And well described, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. But, you know, I think we're gonna stay with it, and I know later in the year, the select committee will be talking about that. Try to figure out a way to suggest something that we can stand up.
Yeah, and I think part of our effort in the past, the direction of the school facilities department at the time, and this is where Dave and Dan and I, we tried to develop our own with the idea that singular, that number, the suitability number would be integrated into an overall number for a building. That included condition, that included capacity, that included suitability. And what we ran into was, yes, we could measure across the many dimensions of what suitability could be thought of. It started to spread the numbers way too thin across the individual component pieces. And so it watered down the suitability number. And so then the range of what the building suitability was, there was just such a small range that it never changed. It really didn't change where a building was in its overall sort of prioritization. And so we sort of just abandoned that and said, if the effort is to try to make it a singular need for a building, this isn't going to get it done.
Yeah.
And so if the idea is that suitability sits separately, the component pieces can be thought of separately, maybe that then provides the districts the opportunity to understand where their needs are, the legislature, the commission, to be able to consider what those specific suitability issues are within the context of a condition, within the context of capacity. The direction is different. But when we tried to do it with an idea of a singular composite number to prioritize all of the buildings, we couldn't accomplish that. And it wasn't for lack of effort and lots of good thinking and lots of like really good intentions by everybody sitting around the table. Perhaps our goal was the wrong goal of trying to come to a composite number versus can we just understand what this suitability, and we didn't like suitability either, so we changed it to functionality. Is the building functional to deliver the basket of goods? And so, yeah, it was just, perhaps we just had the wrong target, the wrong goal of what we were trying to accomplish.
Well, I think to Rich's point back then, what the end result was to give the commission and the legislature a list that you could assign dollars and projects to. And so originally it was, do we do a bad building? Do we do an overcrowded building, or do it unsuitable? So if think way back in the day, I think that condition drove a larger portion of the ratio. And then when we got those caught up, then capacity did. And the belief was later in condition capacity where we would increase suitability. But as we know over time, we're never going to get one list or the other done. So maybe you're right, Rich. Maybe we just do a suitability list. It's probably gonna be all of our older good condition buildings, and maybe we take that to the legislature to deal with on its own.
Well, going back to that thought and to Dave's point. I think that's why I suggested a few minutes ago that be a separate piece. And my question to the sort of physical plant professionals is, do you feel like that would be a good approach for some of the projects that you must be thinking about when you think suitability? Why couldn't we treat it as a component level exercise, separate it out? Because if you make it part of the whole, it doesn't shift anything. But it might be very relevant. It might be a vestibule for safety, security, whatever. But it feels like to me that's how you would maybe go about it on the facility level.
Well, that brings me to where, I don't know if you noticed in there, I talked about a threshold analysis on major, whether it's classroom spaces or floor spaces. And for instance, like cafeteria. I mean, when does the cafeteria capacity hit the point of no return and it's not suitable or adequate? Well, is it three lunches a day, 3 lunch periods a day? Is it 4? Certainly isn't 5 or 6 or 7, I don't think. There's just not enough. Kids' stomachs won't tolerate that many different times. So, we establish a threshold on cafeteria space, common space, media center space, library space, gymnasiums. How many PE sections do we have? How much room does each PE section have to take? Is it a half a gym? Is it can you put three PE sections in each gym? Scheduling conflicts with there's scheduling conflicts with assemblies or athletics or whatever the case may be, and how does that fit into the capacity and suitability of that gymnasium space? Circulation. I mean, what do we talk about? I mean, when do you have traffic jams in the hallways? And can it be easily staggered, through staggered passing times? I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can take the capacity and make it suitable. Today's point. Then there's program space adequacy, CTE. I mean, there's got to be a whole bunch of thresholds on that. I mean, what programs are we putting in these things? And we put welding machinery technology in the same space because there's only 3 sections of welding and there's 3 sections of machining. It may be multi-purpose. I don't know. Some teachers say sure, others say not a chance. I mean that there's. I think Senator, I think you have a great idea. It's just I don't think Rich kind of laid this out. Can't give a suitability score to the whole school. I think you have, or an adequacy score to the whole school. I think you have to look at it on a component basis.
Well, I think might be a starting point for us to think about that. One of the things that drives suitability is decisions by local board. And that creates heartburn down in the legislature, because just by simply voting to make a quick little change in whether it's curriculum or we're gonna put a different class in that classroom. Well, now it's not suitable. And so that's the challenge you run into. And all of us are the ones
we're the ones paying for all this, you know, like you only have a certain capability to be able to fund a lot of this thing, but I do think, I think that we'll be able to get our hands around what suitability might be or how we want to define it. But I just think it's gotta be its own subset. It almost, districts need to be able to come and say, you know what, we need to do such and such with one of those facilities you just talked about. You know, whether it's cafeteria, gymnasium, whatever, or a classroom. And that might be a good way for the commission to say, well, we're gonna do these 10 suitability projects.
No, and I don't mean this negatively, but when I was watching the facility managers, I tell your heads all pretty much going up and down that the newer schools that have been built are adequate problems. Okay, didn't see anybody going on the hill. And this is where I say I don't think it's negative, but suitability is the sins of the past of the school boards. It is. It's all the older buildings, and it's the state didn't say put this in or not put that in, or I want 2 of these and 1 of these. That was the school boards, and you guys deal with this on a freaking annual basis when you get changes, and they want to change this stuff. And quite frankly, all of us sitting in here today, we could come up with a definition of suitability, and I'll bet you your boards would agree. And if they do agree, the next big board turnover, they're not going to agree. And that's really the hard issue, and that's why I agree. I think we work on the things we can work on in here for adequacy, and we say that for a separate issue, because again, experiencing this now for 8 years, very seldom is a suitability issue that has come to my attention has been pointed out to me from the finance district the same as a different school. They're almost always different because it's for that school, for that board, for that superintendent or principal, and for that time. And for that time, yeah, exactly.
And Dale, to go along with that, I get my principals, building administrators, and we do 2-year plans. Okay, every time we do a 2-year plan, they all have their own idea of what they want. So for me, I look at things a little bit different. If I have flexibility within the standards and the guidelines, I can make a space suitable. Not all spaces, but the majority of spaces that we deal with. Now you're dealing with suitability from that building administrator. You know, will that be? I've got one who wants to take a conference room and make it music. Can I make it suitable? Absolutely. But the standards are, we're right into the, you know, where the administrators are, the nurses. You know, I wouldn't recommend it. But that's what we run on. You know, run across. I always tell everybody, TME, time, money, and effort, we can accomplish anything. But having the flexibility within the adequacy standards, having flexibility in the guidelines, the older buildings, when we go into an older building, if I want to make it adequate and I follow guidelines say I really can't sprinkler it unless I booster it down. Or unless I'm doing such a huge renovation, I'm going to turn it into the state and then come back. A lot of times that's not the case. But I can't make that building fully sprinklered unless I use district funds. Well, now with the new funding side one, I can't even do that. So we need some kind of flexibility, because you know, maybe I'm not speaking for everybody here, but I think that that's generally what we come across is, can we do this? Yeah, we can do it. We can make it suitable for your needs most of the time, but we need the flexibility, adequacy standards, and guidelines. For me, that's that simple.
And so, Dan, is some of the flexibility then in the language surrounding allowable usage or major maintenance? You know, I know that, you know, the example was brought up earlier that, well, if I wanted to do this, that would be an upgrade. And major maintenance is generally not allowed for an upgrade of a system, but it is to sort of replace the existing system and kind of bring it up to modern standard. And so is this just is the flexibility then that's being sought within major maintenance around what do we consider allowable usage Cause I know, you know, and I know that like for security, you know, there was the 10% set aside but is that enough?
Yeah, we can upgrade, I mean, that's something. It's, code compliance. Unless you're being directed by your local AHJ, which I don't know an AHJ that will sign off just so that you can do something. You know, it has to be code compliant. If you're built under like 20 years ago, if you're built under that code still stands. Unless you do such a huge renovation that you're required. It's the language like that, that now, especially with us not being able to use some of that money from, you know, the foundation, makes it kind of tough. It's gonna make it a lot harder. Our CTE program, I mean, that money we had to pretty much cover prior to, otherwise we're not gonna have any money to build a CTE. So there's, some stuff is legislative, but as far as, you know, the way the language is in major maintenance, a lot of things we've got taken care of. Grounds was taken care of a couple years ago, I think, on your first build out. So we did take care of an awful lot of that stuff. But it's when it comes time to renovate a building, my personal feeling is if I'm gonna put $5,000 in it, or I'm gonna put $500,000 in it, those kids should have the same building as far as the life safety standpoint as somebody that we just built. But yet, technically, they can't do it unless I figure out a way to do it.
It's also a little problematic. When different needs are of different importance, different districts, how is the department going to prioritize those and say who makes the list, who doesn't? I mean,
But within major maintenance, there technically is.
if there was a certain degree of that, but
The problem,
Like moving wall.
we spent a lot of time, we haven't gained, I think we've gained ground, but we haven't got to where I think you, on the agenda where we're gonna be. Because this is complicated stuff.
It is.
So if we take major maintenance and we use it for any of this stuff that we're talking about now. The formula of 2.5 doesn't work. That's why we got where we were at, because we had 2%, but we found out we were only spending 1.6% on the building. And we had 10% for safety and 10% for enhancements and 10%. We had all these 10% that were coming off the 2%, and so we were only putting 1.6. So the study said come up here, so now we're gonna take some for that. What does that look like? And to me, it's not even equitable, because you'll have a Fremont 24 that's got a new one building and a newer building, although it's not new anymore, but a newer building versus a Campbell and a Laramie that have 40 buildings, and half of them are old, so they don't meet what we agreed there in the last 20 years. So how much of that money are you gonna put towards this to get them there? So I agree, I think it's almost a separate funding issue. And probably some code change or statute change to allow that to happen. But I sure as hell hate to screw around with major maintenance when we finally got it. And we're the shining example of the country, quite frankly, for the meetings that I went to.
So I'm gonna throw another one out. Dan's gonna kick me here too. Let's talk about pools. I would have filled them all in.
I was an athletic director and I kept getting hounded, you know, why don't you put a swimming pool in here? I said, cause that sucking sound is all the money going down.
I've got two that suck, literally. And, but my hand's forced. Again, I'm gonna go to WHSA because we choose to have a swimming program now. Yes, that is a local decision, but there's also a lot of key. I mean, if Evanston pulled out of the swimming program, that's going to create issues. That'll have a ripple effect with other programs. So, yeah, we have to have it. I can have a track, and that's funded fully by major maintenance. If I have to do anything on that track, major maintenance will take care of it. If I do anything on my athletic field, because we can call that PE space and do some things where I can justify, hey, my pools are PE space, but at the end of the day, what do I get? 2%, right? anything that's there. So if we're gonna fund a track, if we're gonna fund a football field, if we're gonna fund a gym that's used after school for basketball and volleyball and everything else, why aren't we funding? Maybe this is where this falls into that adequacy for that pool at 100%.
You know, I have a question on that. You know, we put our kids in the schools, life learners, and you want to have things you can do all your life. You can swim all your life.
Yeah.
You can play golf all your life, but you're not going to play basketball all your life. You're not going to play soccer all your life. You're not going to play softball all your life. And so I think, you know, other than the cost of the pools, personally, I'm just speaking for old Jack Tar right now, the swimming pool is more important than all those other things.
But yet it's
Certainly.
only 10% with our major maintenance.
And I think Gillette has an example of that too with their new rocket center to show the importance of swimming. Well, that's just me. I go with the philosophy that the state has, but
That's been the third rail for 27 years. Nobody wants to touch it, Jack.
I know. I was on the school board for 17 years, so I know.
Well, one of the things that I think everybody here is probably aware of, over the last couple of years, there was a recalibration of funding for the schools. And that particular committee did some things that made some really major changes. I suspect, I'm pretty sure that that's going to be revisited. And I'm looking at our school district folks, because I know you guys have run up against some things that they were cautioned, but that committee decided to do anyway. And this siloed approach is going to really hurt our districts. Some of us said that on the chamber floor of the Senate, and it fell on some deaf ears, and that was pushed through anyway. But I do think that'll be revisited. So some of that I hope will be taken care of with modifications in that recalibration. So we got this separate thing over here that we're working on. I think that'll be worked on too. And hopefully that would be a positive impact on that flexibility piece. So anyway, just wanted to remind everybody that's going to be going on as well. So
really without them revisiting our major maintenance is going to take over again. Just right now, our fire sprinkler systems in the district's paying for, and that's been like that forever. If we don't have it, the district has to pay for it. But now when they take that money from them, they're gonna have to figure out some other ways on safety and security.
Well, that becomes a functional threshold that maybe should be state funded. I mean, if there's codes or rules that get put in place, and all of a sudden that existing school is functionally not adequate. And I mean, then obviously from even a chapter 3 standard, it would not, it would be considered adequate. State, it's probably should be a state funded thing. I don't know.
it seems like that would come into play, that Jim, at a place like CTE space, for example, if one of our guys needed to expand the CTE space, and it was discovered that we've got to get more power in here, for example, there's some of that could come into play. So.
What else? There's, Bill, it may sound like I'm starting to get a picture. It's going to take me a while to synthesize it down into something that we can bring to the next group meeting and get into more specifics. But
on the topic of next meeting, is there information that you all think would be valuable to continuing conversations. So recognizing that you only have so much staff. The division is contracted to consultants who can sort of go out and grab information that you all think would be valuable. So is there information off the top of your head? Is Jim included in his write-up? Kind of, we've looked at a couple, about 5 different states and where they are with their standards and guidelines and things of that sort.
By the way, Wyoming stands alone. There's none of your peer states in the West, your Mountain West or Pacific Northwest have adequacy standards.
Most states do not have the adequacy standards. They have guidelines, and most of that is a function of the ways in which facilities are financed. They're primarily locally financed. The state may provide some supplemental dollars. And so states are then pretty loath to get into adequacy standards. They exist much more in the realm of guidelines. But that effort back in 2010, I think, brought whatever existed in terms of guidelines from 15 to 20 states. Also looked at large school districts, looked at small school districts to the extent that they have standards and guidelines. Would bringing sort of a composite of all of that together for you all, would that be helpful? Would it not be helpful?
So Rich, for me today, been kind of like popcorn. I mean, we're all over the place, which I kind of expected we would be with, all of our different interests. What I would be curious is the two of you, the consultants at the end of the table, if you've heard everything, if we could kind of get a synopsis of where you think our focus is headed next, it helps me kind of wrap my brain around where to be when we come in next time. I mean, we've talked about, we took suitability over here, we put adequacy here, we do some of that. So I'd like to know what you guys have heard, and Jim's taken a lot of notes, and that would be a really good starting point for me before I go and look at other states and other things, because I may be looking at this and Senator Landon's looking at that over there. So I think it helps maybe get us away from popcorn and maybe into a lane.
What if we put butter on?
That would be better, but still. I mean, I fully expected lots of opinions. I mean, lots of years in the trenches with all you guys anyway. I do want to go on record to say, I do think in large part our system is great and it does work and it works well. This is just an opportunity to get some of those little nuances tightened up to make it even better. We don't talk about that suitability. What is it? What isn't it? In your community, in Cheyenne, even in Gillette, when you got multiple schools, what I can tell you at suitability is, it's the parent who's going to this old school wanting to know why they don't have that. It's not even about boards changing. And Dave, why don't you give it to me? Well, because it doesn't come up on the list. And then it's a 2-hour conversation of explaining the different lists. So anyway, I think if you can help our focus, that would be helpful to me.
We take the banks of the river that we have and just kind of provide us guidance with that. I think there's good things happening, and I think we really do have pretty well defined those banks of the river. But within that, what allows us a little autonomy? What allows us to say, hey, this is what we've got to do to you? I think there's some really good dialogue and discussions.
I think the dialogue discussion has been fantastic. I just, I've got 5 or 6 pages of notes. I mean, to sit down, like I say, sit down, try to synthesize those into something that Rich and I will do it together, because he's got as many notes as I do, and maybe more. I don't know. But this has been. It's been very helpful to me. I mean, I've done a lot of research with other states to try to figure out if there's a better, way to lay the bricks. But there's Wyoming is very unique in the fact that you decided to step up and fund this thing and you can't write blank checks. I mean, there's the dilemma. It's easy to fund it. It's just that you can't write, can't have a free for all. You have to have some banks to that river, so to speak. Otherwise, this state would be in big trouble. There'd be a lawsuit a year.
It's pretty fascinating. Trip, on the policy front. Because, that check writing thing, that you hand that over to districts. That's like, turning the responsibility over to somebody and then stand back. You don't know what the results will be. There's a lot of sentiment on all sides of the issue. There's some sentiment in the legislature that is very concerned that the school districts aren't using that money the way that we intend for it to be used. There's that undercurrent that I have to fight against every year.
Well,
because our commission works so hard and our select committee works so hard and our
Staff.
physical plant director worked so hard, and then you go down there and they say, well, those guys just aren't spending the money the way they should. So it's a fascinating tug of war, and you guys talk about that.
And that's to be expected because if you don't see how the cake's been baked, it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to say it's safe to eat. So I mean, and the most legislators aren't privy to what goes on. I have to say that Wyoming does a really good job making sure the money is being spent correctly and judiciously, cost effectively. Sometimes it's painful, but it gets done, and I appreciate the fact that and I think that overall, I think that we're close. And like Dave said, there's just a few things that need to be ferreted out, made better.
Do square footage allocations fall under guideline standards or just under the square foot
It's
calculator?
It's a rule.
It's a rule.
Okay.
Capacity consideration.
So the rules, I think there's gonna have to be some changes to the rules, in particularly because, I think because of the diversity of the state, not all, I think you can have a calculator for floor spaces, but I think auxiliary spaces, other spaces, gonna have to have different standards.
Yeah, when we did that core space for a few buildings, but two high schools that I talked about, MGP actually looked around the nation and looked at what that should equate per student. And that's why then we took that and added that for whether it was a 200 student edition or whatever, we added that and threw it into core space. Now for flexibility, we didn't necessarily say it needs to all go in the kitchen or it goes here or it goes. We just said you got another 5,000 square foot for core space. And when you're doing your design, just figure out where that's kind of going.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So
We did break it into, I think
Yeah, I was
he
gonna
had so much for the kitchen,
we
that,
did specify it. We
Yeah.
said 5,000 for this space, this much is for cafeteria space, this
Right.
much is for, and we used 3 lunch periods. I think it was like 22 square foot per student or something like that for the
Yeah.
cafeteria. But we specified where that space was to go because we didn't want to, we were trying to size the cafeteria to
Right.
allow for an add-on. So we can't let them take that space and go put it somewhere else, because then when they add on, we aren't gonna have cafeteria space.
Jim, we need to give you those numbers. That needs to go into what we're looking at.
Yeah.
Along with thou shalt design those around the exterior of the building, that's stuff that I think needs to go into those standards. To be able to-
So when a Mercer study is done, does that also utilize those rules and standards? So if I have a facility that I want studied and the study is done on that facility, whether it's a scrape and rebuild, whether it's remodel of this or remodel of the entire facility or just a section of it, are those applied, are those rules applied to that Mercer study and evaluating that facility to determine whether it's a scrape and rebuild or whether it's a remodel?
The Mercer's gonna come through and say, let's take CTE as an example.
Uh-huh.
The methodology, the capacity methodology says it's 125. But we said, we're gonna increase that to 200. Those 75 extra square feet need to be in CTE. They can't put them someplace else.
Yeah.
They've got to be in the CTE. That's gonna take a change to our capacity methodology. And so if we've said, here's your allowable square foot, but if we've added extra, we've been very specific as to where that goes.
What we have done is we have applied that uniformly on all the new things that we are doing.
Yes.
Because we, the director, want to see that 200 foot in that new standard, because that's what I've been hearing for years. And now we have this change, as we talked about, mindset on CTE versus college versus whatever.
You know, the only caution, everyone, is I'm not sure you want to silo that. No. I think the idea is to pay our districts for that extra square footage, CTE, but leave it up to our professionals to know where that money's got to go. If you silo it and say that extra square footage of money that we're sending you has to go into that facility right there. That seems to me like we're tying hands that you wouldn't necessarily want to tie, but we can sort that out as we go. But
when you're saying, so are you talking CTE or are you talking that for the cafeteria for the
CTE?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we're just saying in the future, when you build, we're gonna, just like we do right now, say 125, put it where you want it for whatever program. It's 200. But the issue with Shelby said right now is, I've never heard until recently, we need 13 CTE programs. That never came up my first time as director. And that's where we're kind of struggling now. How do we size that for a new school?
I would have, if somebody, I'm just saying this, if the district comes in and says, I need 13 different CTE facilities, programs, I think I would have to say, you need to show me how that's justified. Because, the local market probably would justify it.
And that's, I think to your point, we had something that was quite a while back on our Mercer study of South High School that addressed CTE, and they put programs in that weren't your typical CTE programs, right? And there was a feasibility about that on whether or not, what do they actually produce? How many people are going to go through it? And what's the outcome of it, right? So if it's not producing something that fits into the market and is actually, the words were in that study, but basically productive program coming through, it wasn't really feasible to incorporate it in there. So I do think that's probably something that would have to be looked at.
I think great example, Cary Junior High, when we opened it, they wanted sewing. 27 sewing machines around the perimeter of family consumer science. We didn't have a program in the high school that fed it. So that drove us to nix that program. And
I think if the state is reimbursing, especially at a higher rate on CTE programming, I think there will certainly be some oversight there. I think it's going to go to which of these programs are going to be approved and which are not. You know, so
Well,
that,
but what we've seen in when we're doing some of these bursars is you can have art that is not a CTE, but once the teacher gets certified,
Put the
it
three
can become a
classes together.
CTE. They didn't change a damn thing. Number of kids stayed the same, but now it becomes a CTE. And once it becomes a CTE, it's 60 square foot instead of 50 square foot.
The
Or
slippery
40
slope, slippery slope on this is industry, like we're talking, can drive some of it. You get into the classroom realm, it's the personality of the teacher.
Yeah.
And you get a great teacher, they draw kids, that teacher retires, the next person comes in, and now you're down to just.
That's
So it's a very tricky. When you guys are talking cafeterias, are you talking secondary? About number of lunches and stuff? The reason I ask is because an elementary cafeteria usually is the gym. So actually the driver there is how many minutes I have, and I can still offer PE. I can get lunch in and out clean, but obviously secondary, my common area, it serves as both, you know, then it's just a matter of getting kids through and feeding. So those two standards are very different. Just keep that in mind.
Well, I think you have to, obviously, you have to figure that out.
Yeah.
On your analysis is how is it utilized? What are the conflicts with how many programs have to be in that same space?
Right.
It's good.
Versus a
Cafeteria.
Dave was saying earlier, you know, this is a little bit of a problem. But is there any areas, because you guys hear differently than what we hear, is there any areas of concern from legislators that we should be looking at that are different from us?
well, I think that's a great question, and as we kind of gone along this morning, I tried to share with you a little bit of sentiment that I pick up on inside the legislature. I think that piece of state versus local, I don't think that's going to go away. And quite frankly, much of it will depend upon the next election and the one after that. You know, what direction Wyoming wants to go. And if we go in a direction that I've seen just in the last 3 or 4 years, I think there's more of a notion that Cheyenne should control a lot of this and not so much local control. That's just my observation. I might be the only one who feels that way, but that's kind of the way I've been seeing that. So, you know, I think the biggest piece that I want to try to get right is this suitability piece. And, you know, I think that's on everyone's mind, the lawsuit, you know, getting things correct. And then that piece that I shared with you, the recalibration piece that I think was a little out of kilter on a couple of spots. So all of that, I think, is going to be things you're going to hear about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just an observation from me. We don't really seem to have a whole lot of disagreements when it comes to the adequacy standards. I mean, I'm not like when we first started, there was all kinds of spikes even back what was 2010. So I'm just kind of curious as to if they have different concerns about anything in the adequacy standards or the guidelines that they brought up that said, hey, we wish you guys would visit this.
And in my dealing with the legislature, I haven't heard that from the design standards. What I've heard more is prototype schools, some of that kind of stuff. But I think we got kind of over that hump where individual districts kind of have their prototypes to work on, but they're still somewhat unique. Even within the districts, there's no changes. Some of them could be just the site itself would constrain you from building the same type of school that I might have built two of before. Foundations is different. Some of that, I mean, you just can't have a set of plans and we just give it to you because one district has 200 kids in that school and another district with the exact same grade configuration that have 300 or 500, you know, those kind of things. And then, yeah, there's K1s, there's K3s, there's K4s, there's K5, 6s. So how do you have like school, unless they're gonna come back to what the senator said, and Cheyenne's gonna control and say, no, you can't, everything's gonna be a K-5 or whatever, you know. So, so I think we've kind of got over that, and we still hear that from time to time, how come we don't have both types? My standard answer to that has been, we do look at those old building plans. The districts look at old building plans. When you come up, I've seen a number of districts go out and get building plans from other districts when they're finally gonna get a new building and look at those as to what they want. And so I really think we're kind of where we need to be in that.
So that's why the originally was given us, you know, what's not working. It seems like most things are working.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, we're not far off.
yeah. The only other thing that I've heard is that it costs too much to build schools in Wyoming compared to people around us. And we've gone out and looked at some of that, and one state's a little higher, another state's a little lower. I think if you plotted it all out, we're falling in some curve there. And frankly, it is cheaper to build a school in Colorado where you got 400 contractors gonna bid on it, and you got lots more tradesmen and you don't have to ship shit 400 miles to get it there than it is in Wyoming, where you gotta, you know, get to base Wyoming, that the whole building team has to either drive 3 hours to get there, or they gotta put it in motels. So,
There are people.
yeah, that's everybody.
There's one and they'll have about
So we've
10
got
rooms.
our own challenges, just, you know, in the state along the lines, yeah.
So in an effort to uphold Jim's promise that we'll be out of here no later than 11:50, it's 11:50. Thanks Del and Shelby for creating this process. It harkens back to the day where we were very collaborative, sitting around the table, trying to hash some of this stuff out. It's a little sort of heartening that stuff we did 20 years ago has, for the most part, held up. And now we need to just sort of figure out some of the things around the edges. And I appreciate everybody coming around the table to participate and sort of put good thinking and good intentions at the center of our effort. So with that, 11:50.
Thanks for advice. How are we gonna have the next meeting? So are we talking Zoom meetings? What you guys?
I think probably the next 1 or 2 meetings can be Zoom meetings. And I think probably 4 weeks here next meeting, maybe try to get, you know, try to see, judge our progress. Maybe we come out less frequent or more frequent from there.
And we'll try to get to our synthesized notes here sooner than later.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.